A civilization can disappear so completely that even its greatest achievements become anonymous. Names are forgotten, languages fall silent, borders vanish. Yet somewhere beyond the written record, enormous structures remain exactly where their makers left them. Stone towers overlook empty landscapes. Ceremonial platforms rise from abandoned settlements. Strange openings lead into walls built for purposes no one remembers, while isolated monuments preserve designs that have survived far longer than the cultures behind them. They are physical pieces of worlds we can no longer enter, offering just enough evidence to show what once existed, but never enough to restore the complete picture. Today, we cross that distance between the world that survived and the world that disappeared, searching for the stories still locked inside the ancient past. Krishna's butterball rises above the granite landscape of Mahabalipuram on India's southeastern coast in Tamil Nadu, only a short distance from the UNESCO-listed Pallava monuments. European surveyors documented the remarkable boulder during the 19th century while recording the rock-cut temples scattered across the hill, but local communities had known it for centuries under traditions connected with the Hindu god Krishna. Unlike the surrounding shrines, however, this immense granite mass was never carved into architecture. It simply remained where it stood, balanced on a sloping bedrock surface so improbably that generations of archaeologists, geologists, engineers, and visitors have continued asking the same question. Why has it never fallen? The boulder measures roughly 6 meters high and 5 meters across, with most scientific estimates placing its weight between about 250 and 300 metric tons. At first glance, the contact area between the stone and the underlying rock appears astonishingly small, while the supporting slope inclines at approximately 40 to 45 degrees. Human intuition suggests that gravity should eventually overcome such an arrangement, yet geological evidence indicates the opposite. The rock has likely occupied this position for many thousands of years, surviving tropical monsoons, seasonal temperature fluctuations, repeated weathering, and countless cycles of erosion. It also remained unmoved after the devastating 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami, an event that dramatically reshaped sections of the nearby coastline and even revealed archaeological remains previously buried beneath coastal sediments. The survival of the boulder through such extreme natural forces has become one of the strongest reasons it continues to fascinate researchers. Modern geology explains much of this apparent paradox without removing every uncertainty. Krishna's butterball consists of ancient granite belonging to the Precambrian formations underlying the Coromandel coast. The rock itself is interpreted as a classic example of spheroidal weathering, a process in which fractures allow groundwater to penetrate granite over immense geological timescales. Chemical alteration gradually rounds exposed blocks, while surrounding material erodes away, eventually leaving isolated boulders that appear almost sculpted. Similar formations occur elsewhere around the world, but few display such an extraordinary balance. Detailed geological studies suggest that the visible contact area is misleading because the boulder's center of mass lies well within its supporting base, while microscopic irregularities along both rock surfaces generate far greater friction than observers expect. Even so, no field demonstration has fully reproduced why such a massive object appears so precariously perched while remaining remarkably stable. The explanation satisfies the equations of mechanics, yet continues to challenge ordinary visual perception, leaving the site suspended between scientific understanding and instinctive disbelief. That geological interpretation also raises a deeper archaeological question. Krishna's butterball stands within one of the greatest concentrations of early medieval rock-cut architecture in South Asia. During the 7th and 8th centuries, the Pallava dynasty transformed Mahabalipuram into a ceremonial landscape filled with monolithic temples, cave sanctuaries, enormous relief carvings, and unfinished monuments that demonstrate exceptional mastery of granite. Craftsmen removed thousands of tons of stone to create structures such as the Pancharathas and the celebrated Descent of the Ganges relief. If they possessed the knowledge and labour required to reshape entire hillsides, why was this enormous boulder deliberately left untouched? Archaeology has never produced a definitive answer. No inscription describes its purpose, no contemporary text explains its significance, and no surviving artwork identifies it as a sacred monument. Rather than being an obstacle, the stone appears to have been incorporated naturally into the surrounding sacred landscape, suggesting that its unusual appearance may already have carried symbolic importance before monumental construction began. Whether the Pallavas regarded it as a divine feature, a landmark, a ritual gathering point, or simply an untouchable element of the terrain, remains unknown. The uncertainty becomes even greater because the familiar name Krishna's butterball is not ancient. It emerged much later through local folklore, comparing the rounded granite mass with the butter beloved by the child god Krishna in Hindu tradition. Archaeologists cannot demonstrate that the Pallava builders used this name or even associated the boulder with Krishna at all. The original identity of the stone has disappeared from the historical record. That missing cultural context creates one of archaeology's greatest limitations. Physical evidence can establish the age of monuments, identify construction techniques, and reconstruct ancient landscapes. But when written records are absent, the meanings attached to natural landmarks often vanish completely. The boulder therefore survives as an object whose physical existence is unquestionable, while its cultural significance remains almost entirely speculative. Colonial accounts added another layer to the mystery. According to widely repeated reports from the early 20th century, the governor of Madras, Arthur Lawley, considered the boulder potentially dangerous because of its apparent instability and ordered an attempt to remove it. Several elephants, commonly described as 7, were reportedly harnessed to pull the rock away from the slope. Despite their combined strength, the effort failed to shift the granite even slightly. Historians continue debating how accurately later retellings reflect the original event, and some details may have become embellished over time. Nevertheless, the persistence of the story reflects an important reality. Engineers expected the stone to move far more easily than it actually did, reinforcing the contrast between human expectation and the mechanical stability demonstrated by the boulder itself. Scientific investigations today increasingly rely on high-resolution topographic mapping, structural geology, and digital three-dimensional modeling to understand the relationship between the boulder and its bedrock foundation. Laser scanning can measure subtle variations across the contact surfaces with millimeter precision, while drone photogrammetry reconstructs the surrounding terrain in exceptional detail. These methods have strengthened the interpretation that the stone occupies a naturally stable equilibrium rather than an impossible one. Yet they cannot answer every archaeological question, because the most important uncertainties concern human decisions rather than geological processes. Researchers still cannot determine whether ancient people modified the supporting surface, whether small adjustments were made to stabilize the boulder before nearby monuments were constructed, or whether its placement influenced the overall planning of the sacred complex. Excavation beneath the contact area is effectively impossible without threatening the monument itself, leaving some hypotheses beyond direct testing. The unfinished monuments surrounding Krishna's butterball deepen the sense that Mahabalipuram preserves a landscape frozen in the middle of transformation. Across the granite hills are abandoned carving marks, incomplete shrines, and partially excavated sanctuaries whose construction suddenly ceased for reasons that remain debated. Political change within the Pallava kingdom, shifting religious priorities, economic pressures, or interruptions caused by warfare have all been proposed, yet no single explanation accounts for every unfinished structure. Against that backdrop, the untouched boulder appears less like an isolated curiosity and more like part of a broader archaeological puzzle concerning how natural rock formations and monumental architecture interacted within one evolving ceremonial landscape. The Sukur cultural landscape lies in the Mandara Mountains of northeastern Nigeria, near the border with Cameroon, and at first glance appears to be little more than a maze of stone terraces climbing a steep hillside. Yet this UNESCO World Heritage Site preserves one of Africa's most sophisticated examples of pre-industrial engineering, where architecture, metallurgy, hydrology, and landscape design were combined into a single functioning system centuries before modern surveying equipment existed. The greatest mystery is not what Sukur's builders created, but how they mastered technologies whose practical details have largely disappeared. Unlike many archaeological discoveries uncovered beneath deep layers of sediment, Sukur never truly vanished from the landscape. Local communities continued to occupy the surrounding region, but systematic archaeological and anthropological investigations during the 20th century revealed that the mountain settlement represented far more than a traditional village. Detailed surveys documented an extensive network of dry stone walls, ceremonial structures, agricultural terraces, roads, iron smelting remains, and hydraulic features spread across the mountainside. In 1999, UNESCO recognized Sukur as the first Nigerian cultural landscape to receive World Heritage status, citing the exceptional preservation of an integrated technological and cultural system that had evolved over many centuries. Among every surviving feature, the evidence of iron production raises the greatest unanswered questions. Long before European industrial metallurgy reached West Africa, Sukur had already become an important regional centre for iron manufacture. Excavations have uncovered numerous furnace bases, slag deposits, tuyere fragments, charcoal concentrations, and forged iron artifacts, demonstrating that metallurgy formed the economic foundation of the settlement. Chemical studies of the slag indicate repeated smelting campaigns rather than isolated experiments, while radiocarbon dating places significant phases of iron production roughly between the 13th and 16th centuries, although iron working in the Mandara region almost certainly began earlier. The challenge is that successful bloomery smelting requires a remarkably precise balance of variables. Iron oxides must be reduced at temperatures approaching approximately 1,100 to 1,300 degrees Celsius. Below this range, metallic iron fails to separate efficiently from the ore. Above it, the bloom may absorb excessive carbon or the furnace structure itself begins to deteriorate. Maintaining such conditions demands continuous control of airflow, fuel consumption, furnace geometry, and ore composition without thermometers, pressure gauges, or modern refractory materials. What continues to puzzle archaeometallurgists is how Sukur's metalworkers achieved this consistency on a rugged mountainside. The surviving furnaces are relatively modest in size, yet slag analysis suggests prolonged operation under stable thermal conditions. Some researchers propose that the builders intentionally positioned furnaces where seasonal mountain winds accelerated naturally through narrow passages, creating a self-regulating draft that reduced dependence on continuous manual bellows operation. Others argue that carefully engineered tuyères introduced air into the combustion chamber at specific angles, increasing combustion efficiency while minimizing heat loss. Neither explanation has been demonstrated conclusively because the upper portions of the furnaces have almost entirely disappeared, leaving only their lower foundations and scattered fragments. The missing architectural elements may have contained precisely the engineering features responsible for their remarkable performance. Fuel management introduces another layer of complexity. Producing bloomery iron consumes enormous quantities of high-quality charcoal. Experimental archaeology has shown that several kilograms of charcoal may be required to produce a single kilogram of usable iron, depending on ore quality and furnace efficiency. Such demand would normally threaten rapid deforestation, yet paleo-environmental evidence suggests that the Sukur region sustained iron production for generations without complete ecological collapse. Researchers suspect that woodland resources were managed through controlled harvesting cycles, but direct evidence remains limited. Whether the community consciously practiced long-term forest management or benefited from favourable environmental conditions remains unresolved, making Sukur an unusually early example of potentially sustainable heavy industry. The ore itself presents additional questions. Geological surveys identify iron-bearing formations within reachable distance of the settlement, but the mineral quality varies considerably. Successful bloomery technology requires more than simply collecting reddish stones from the landscape. Experienced smelters must recognize ore with appropriate iron concentrations, while avoiding excessive impurities such as silica or phosphorus that reduce bloom quality. No written manuals survive to explain how Sukur's craftsmen selected, sorted, roasted or prepared their ore before smelting. Yet the surviving slag demonstrates that these choices were consistently effective over long periods. This level of accumulated empirical knowledge rivals metallurgical traditions documented elsewhere in Africa, including those of the Haya people in present-day Tanzania, whose furnaces achieved exceptionally high thermal efficiencies. Whether similar technological principles evolved independently in Sukur or spread through regional exchange networks remains an active subject of debate. Equally remarkable is the integration of metallurgy into the settlement's overall design. Iron production was not isolated in a distant industrial district, but carefully positioned within a landscape already constrained by steep slopes, residential compounds, ceremonial spaces, livestock enclosures and agricultural terraces. Furnaces required access to ore, water, charcoal, labour and ventilation, while simultaneously minimizing fire hazards to nearby structures. The spatial organisation suggests deliberate planning rather than gradual accumulation. Even today, archaeologists cannot fully reconstruct the decision-making process that determined why each production area occupies its specific location on the mountain. Beyond metallurgy, Sukur displays an equally sophisticated understanding of stone engineering. Hundreds of dry stone retaining walls stabilize terraces across gradients that would normally experience severe erosion during Nigeria's intense rainy seasons. Many walls remain standing despite centuries of seasonal weathering, even though they contain no mortar whatsoever. Instead, builders selected individual stones whose shapes lock together under compression, distributing weight laterally while allowing minor movement during ground settlement. Modern geotechnical engineers recognize this flexibility as one reason dry stone structures can outperform rigid masonry under changing environmental conditions. Yet the builders achieved it entirely through experience rather than mathematical structural analysis. The agricultural terraces reveal another level of engineering intelligence. Rather than cutting broad horizontal platforms, the inhabitants created narrow stepped fields that slowed runoff, trap fertile sediment, reduce slope instability, and increased moisture retention. Remote sensing and topographic studies indicate that these terraces function as interconnected hydraulic units rather than isolated plots. Water descending the mountain loses velocity as it encounters successive retaining walls, dramatically reducing erosive force before reaching lower elevations. Such integrated landscape management resembles principles employed in several of the world's great terrace civilizations, although Sukur developed under very different environmental and cultural conditions. Water management itself remains surprisingly understated. Visitors expecting monumental aqueducts or large reservoirs often overlook the ingenuity hidden within the terrain. Instead of forcing water through conspicuous channels, Sukur relies on subtle stone-lined pathways, natural fractures, carefully graded surfaces, and drainage gaps incorporated into retaining walls. During heavy rainfall, runoff disperses through numerous small routes rather than concentrating into destructive torrents. The entire mountainside functions as a distributed hydraulic network, one that becomes visible only when examined as an integrated engineering system instead of a collection of individual structures. Do you think Sukur's lost ironworking techniques and engineering knowledge could ever be fully reconstructed? Or has part of that ancient expertise disappeared forever? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The Temple of Fortuna Primigenia stands above the modern town of Palestrina, about 35 kilometers east of Rome, as one of the largest religious complexes ever built by the Roman Republic. Long before Imperial Rome raised the Colosseum or the Pantheon, engineers here reshaped an entire limestone hillside into an immense sequence of terraces, stairways, retaining walls, vaulted chambers, and ceremonial plazas. More than 2,000 years later, archaeologists still debate not why the sanctuary was sacred, but how a civilization without modern surveying instruments, geotechnical science, or powered machinery transformed an unstable mountain into an architectural system that has survived earthquakes, erosion, and centuries of rebuilding. Its existence had never been completely forgotten because medieval buildings occupied much of the ancient terraces, but the true scale of the sanctuary remained hidden until extensive excavations began after Allied bombing during the Second World War destroyed large sections of Palestrina in 1944. Beneath the collapsed Renaissance structures, archaeologists uncovered enormous concrete substructures, vaulted galleries, monumental staircases, and retaining walls that revealed an engineering achievement far beyond earlier expectations. Further excavations confirmed that most of the sanctuary had been constructed between approximately 120 and 80 BCE, making it one of the earliest monumental examples of Roman concrete architecture. The greatest mystery begins with the mountain itself. Greek sanctuaries usually adapted their buildings to the landscape, but the builders of Fortuna Primigenia attempted something fundamentally different. Instead of placing a temple on a summit, they converted nearly the entire hillside into an artificial architectural machine. The sanctuary extends across a vertical rise of roughly 50 meters and stretches almost 300 meters from its lowest terraces to the upper sanctuary. Every visible platform conceals layers of retaining structures, filled embankments, vaulted corridors, drainage passages, and supporting chambers buried deep inside the slope. Modern engineers recognize this as an immense earth-retaining system rather than a collection of isolated buildings, yet the calculations required for such stability remain difficult to explain. Today, geotechnical engineers evaluate slope safety using soil cohesion, friction angles, groundwater pressure, and numerical modeling before excavation begins. Roman builders possessed none of these mathematical frameworks, Yet the mountain they reshaped has remained remarkably stable for over 2 millennia, despite repeated seismic activity in central Italy and centuries of weathering. Excavations reveal that enormous quantities of bedrock were removed before construction even started. Archaeologists estimate that tens of thousands of cubic meters of limestone had to be quarried directly from the hillside to create the stepped platforms visible today. Without explosives, hydraulic excavators, or steel machinery, workers relied on iron picks, wedges, hammers, chisels, and controlled fracturing of the rock. The astonishing question is not whether such excavation was possible, but how planners maintained precise geometric alignment while continuously altering the mountain beneath their own construction. Every new terrace depended upon the stability of the one below it. A single major miscalculation could have triggered progressive collapse across the entire complex, yet no evidence suggests catastrophic structural failure during antiquity. What makes this even more remarkable is that the sanctuary functions less like architecture and more like a massive retaining wall disguised as a religious monument. Behind almost every visible facade lies another hidden structural layer. Thick concrete walls absorb horizontal pressure from the hillside, while barrel vaults distribute loads into adjoining supports rather than concentrating stress at isolated points. Modern structural analysis has demonstrated that arches dramatically reduce bending forces by converting vertical loads into compression. But this principle was being exploited here generations before Roman engineering reached its classical imperial peak. The sanctuary, therefore, represents not merely decorative architecture, but an early experiment in large-scale structural mechanics whose underlying design philosophy appeared centuries ahead of its time. The concrete itself introduces another unresolved puzzle. Temple of Fortuna Primigenia is among the earliest surviving monuments to employ opus caementicium on such an extraordinary scale. Instead of carving every structural element from stone blocks, Roman engineers poured concrete between masonry facings, producing walls capable of carrying enormous loads while reducing construction time. Scientific analysis of surviving Roman concrete from the Republican period has identified mixtures containing lime, volcanic ash known as pozzolana, and volcanic aggregates that chemically reacted with water to form durable calcium aluminum silicate hydrates. Recent mineralogical studies published in journals including Science Advances have demonstrated that certain Roman concretes continued strengthening through long-term mineral reactions and even displayed forms of self-healing as lime clasts reacted with infiltrating water. Whether exactly the same mechanisms operated within the earliest concrete used at Fortuna Primigenia remains uncertain because the composition varies between construction phases, yet many structural cores continue supporting massive loads after more than 2,000 years with surprisingly limited degradation. Equally intriguing is the network hidden beneath the ceremonial terraces. A mountain naturally accumulates groundwater, and hydrostatic pressure behind retaining walls is among the greatest causes of structural collapse in ancient masonry. If rainwater had been trapped behind the sanctuary's walls, increasing pressure would eventually have displaced entire sections downhill. Instead, the complex survived centuries of seasonal rainfall. Archaeologists have documented channels, culverts, drainage galleries, and internal passages that redirected water away from critical foundations, although significant portions of the hydraulic network remain inaccessible beneath later construction. The complete drainage system has never been fully reconstructed, leaving unanswered how Roman engineers calculated water flow through such an enormous artificial hillside without hydraulic equations or modern surveying equipment. Visitors climbing through the sanctuary today experience an overwhelming sense of symmetry, Yet this apparent simplicity conceals another engineering challenge. The monumental central staircase aligns successive terraces, porticos, plazas, and finally the upper sanctuary along a remarkably consistent axial plan despite the irregular topography beneath. Surveyors now rely on total stations, satellite positioning, laser scanning, and digital terrain models to maintain such geometric accuracy across steep landscapes. Roman agrimensores possessed only ropes, measuring rods, plumb lines, water levels, and the groma. Nevertheless, the sanctuary demonstrates an exceptional command of spatial planning over hundreds of meters of changing elevation. Archaeological measurements indicate only minimal cumulative deviation across the principal architectural axis, suggesting surveying precision that still surprises specialists studying Republican engineering. Another mystery concerns the extraordinary number of vaulted chambers concealed within the terraces. These spaces were not simply storage rooms. Many functioned as structural voids, reducing the weight of the artificial embankments while simultaneously transferring loads through compression into deeper foundations. This strategy resembles modern approaches to reducing dead load within large retaining structures. Yet no surviving Roman technical treatise explains how designers determined the dimensions, spacing, or sequence of these chambers. Vitruvius wrote about architecture nearly a century later, leaving the original engineering methods employed at Fortuna Primigenia largely undocumented. Modern conservation projects employing laser scanning, photogrammetry, and structural monitoring continue revealing new details about the sanctuary's internal organization. Digital reconstructions increasingly demonstrate that every terrace, retaining wall, vault, staircase, and plaza belong to a single integrated engineering concept rather than independent construction campaigns. Even so, the mathematical principles guiding that concept remain largely invisible. The builders left no construction manuals, no design drawings, and no written explanation of how they transformed a steep mountain into one of antiquity's most ambitious architectural systems. At a bend of the Vonau River, about 28 kilometers southwest of Poitiers in western France, Sanxai preserves the remains of a Gallo-Roman complex whose engineering is far more difficult to explain than its quiet rural setting suggests. Across more than 25 hectares once stood temples, residences, water installations, and a theatre built for approximately 6,500 spectators. Yet much of the settlement now lies beneath fields, leaving only fragments of a much larger machine. The ruins had been known locally for centuries and were repeatedly stripped for reusable stone before systematic excavation began. In 1881, the Jesuit archaeologist Camille de la Croix arrived with around 15 workers and spent more than 2 years clearing large sections of the ancient settlement. Because he had only rented the land, many trenches were filled again when the campaign ended, burying structures that had barely been recorded. Later investigations between 1985 and 1994 revealed that several of his interpretations were incomplete, particularly his identification of the water complex as an ordinary Roman bathhouse. Sanxai reached its monumental peak during the 2nd century CE, when builders transformed the valley into a sanctuary serving worshippers, patients, and large public gatherings. The main sacred enclosure measured roughly 79 by 76 meters and surrounded an unusual octagonal temple. Across the river, an 89-meter-wide theatre was cut against the natural slope, reducing the amount of artificial support required while still providing space for thousands of spectators. The builders were not imposing a rigid urban grid on level ground. They were making 3 very different monuments function across uneven terrain divided by flowing water. The theatre offers one of the clearest examples of this calculated adaptation. Instead of constructing a vast freestanding framework, its cavea was pressed into the hillside and its walls were placed almost directly onto exposed bedrock, after weaker surface layers had been removed. The masonry consisted largely of small limestone blocks cut into slightly tapered forms and laid in lime mortar, with occasional horizontal courses of fired ceramic material. Such bands could help level successive construction stages, distribute stresses and interrupt irregular cracking, while the limestone core remained thick enough to carry the timber seating once installed above it. This was not indestructible construction, but it was an economical system in which geology, wall geometry, and material selection compensated for the absence of massive foundations. The deeper mystery lies in the condition of the masonry that remains. Sangsai has endured roughly 18 centuries of rainwater penetration, plant growth, winter freezing, thermal expansion, and repeated human disturbance. Large quantities of stone were removed after antiquity, yet surviving walls still retain coherent faces, corners, channels, and pool outlines. Their durability cannot simply be attributed to unusually hard stone. The builders combined local limestone rubble, carefully fitted facing blocks, lime-based binders, and fired clay elements in walls designed to tolerate moisture rather than seal it completely. Lime mortar behaves very differently from modern Portland cement. It is relatively flexible, vapor-permeable, and capable of accommodating small movements without forcing stress into brittle stone. As freshly prepared lime reacts with atmospheric carbon dioxide, calcium carbonate gradually forms within the binder, strengthening it over time. Tiny cracks may sometimes close when moisture dissolves calcium compounds and redeposits carbonate inside the fracture, although no published scientific analysis has yet demonstrated unique self-healing formula specifically at Sangsai. The real technological question is therefore more subtle. How did regional builders select aggregate size, lime proportion, ceramic inclusions, and wall thickness so effectively without chemical laboratories or standardized industrial materials? The occasional ceramic layers are especially important. Crushed brick and fired clay can react with lime to produce hydraulic compounds that harden more effectively in damp conditions, a principle repeatedly identified in studies of Roman and later historic mortars. Even when ceramic pieces were inserted as complete leveling courses rather than ground into powder, their porous surfaces improved mechanical bonding and helped control construction tolerances. At Sangsai, however, the precise composition of different mortars, the source of their lime, and the degree to which ceramic material contributed chemically, rather than structurally, remain insufficiently characterized in publicly available research. The walls survive, but the recipe behind their performance has not been reconstructed in full. Moisture management may have mattered as much as the mortar itself. The sanctuary stood beside a river and incorporated springs, pools, heated rooms, and drainage routes, exposing its masonry to repeated wetting and drying. Roman builders avoided relying on a single impermeable barrier. Water was redirected through slopes, channels, layered floors and voids, while breathable lime joints allowed trapped moisture to escape. In surviving walls, durability may result not from one miraculous substance, but from a complete system in which no component was forced to perform alone. Stone carried compression, mortar absorbed movement, ceramic courses corrected levels, and drainage reduced prolonged saturation. The octagonal temple demonstrates an even more deliberate relationship between water and structure. A spring emerged near the southeastern foundation of the sacred chamber, where large blocks were laid without tightly sealing every joint, apparently allowing water to be collected or pass through the foundation zone. This means that the builders may have designed the monument around a living hydraulic feature rather than attempting to eliminate it. Supporting a tall, sacred building above an active source required them to understand where pressure would accumulate, which materials could remain damp, and how water might be admitted without gradually washing the foundation apart. The so-called baths complicate the picture further. Archaeologists have identified at least 8 construction phases in this sector. Rooms were added, pools were altered, earlier sacred spaces were converted, floors were raised, and separate bathing installations were linked into an increasingly dense complex. Some expected elements of a conventional public bath are absent from the earliest phases, including a clearly organised cold room in one section. This has led researchers to reinterpret the building not simply as a civic therme, but as a sanctuary where immersion, heat, and healing rituals may have overlapped. From an engineering perspective, the repeated transformations are extraordinary. Every new pool increased the weight imposed on older walls. Each heated chamber changed local temperature and humidity. Raising a floor altered drainage gradients, while opening a passage through an existing structure could redirect forces into masonry never designed for the new arrangement. Yet the complex remained in use through successive modifications rather than being demolished and rebuilt from the ground up. The builders appear to have understood the hidden capacity of older foundations well enough to reuse them, but no calculations, construction manuals, or regional building records explain how those decisions were made. The heating system would also have required careful control. Furnaces sent hot gases beneath raised floors supported on small pillars and sometimes through hollow wall elements. If passages were too narrow, smoke and heat would stagnate near the furnace. If they were too large, the gases would cool before reaching distant rooms. Floors had to resist concentrated loads while remaining thin enough to transmit heat. At Sangsai, the challenge was intensified by continuous renovation, because new heated areas had to connect with older spaces whose original airflow had already been established. Even the theatre's strange plan resists a simple explanation. Its seating curve extends beyond the normal semicircle of a classical Roman theatre, while the orchestra is nearly circular and the stage structure appears comparatively small. It belongs to a group of mixed Gallo-Roman performance buildings that combined features of theatres and amphitheatres, possibly allowing ceremonies, dramatic performances, and more physical spectacles within the same enclosure. The structure was therefore not merely copied from an imperial model, it was redesigned for regional use. Yet the practical rules governing sightlines, crowd movement, and acoustics have not survived. Do you think modern engineers could faithfully reproduce Sangsai using only the tools and knowledge available nearly 2,000 years ago? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Ishi no Hoden stands on the slope of Mount Hoden in Takasago, Hyogo Prefecture, Japan, enclosed within the grounds of Oshiko Shrine. It was already known when the Harima Provincial Gazetteer was compiled in the early 8th century, while the German physician Philipp Franz von Siebold later recorded it in detailed sketches published in 1832. Modern investigation began measuring rather than merely describing the monument, and between 2005 and 2006 researchers working with the Takasago City Board of Education and Oteme University produced a 3-dimensional survey of its surfaces. What they documented was not a transported boulder, but an immense object carved directly from the living rock and left almost detached inside the quarry from which it emerged. The survey calculated a width of approximately 6.49 meters, a height of 5.71 meters, and a total depth of about 7.39 meters when the large projection on its rear is included. Its volume was estimated at 203.5 cubic meters. Using a density of 2.285 tons per cubic meter, researchers calculated a mass of roughly 465 tons, lower than the frequently repeated popular estimate of 500 or even 600 tons, but still extraordinary for a single worked block. The material is Tatsuyama stone, a volcanic tuff formed from pyroclastic deposits created approximately 100 million years ago. It was workable enough to become an important regional building stone, yet durable enough to survive in sarcophagi, temple foundations, castle walls, and monumental architecture for more than 16 centuries. Its geological setting removes one popular misconception, but deepens the archaeological problem. Ishi no Hoden was not hauled to the mountain by an unknown technology. Ancient workers selected a mass within the bedrock and excavated downward around it, leaving narrow passages along the sides and rear. They shaped the remaining stone into a vertical rectangular body with a smaller central section and a roof-like projection extending from one face. Most of the block was released from the surrounding rock, but a concealed stone connection beneath it remained attached to the floor. Water gathers inside the excavated basin and hides that support, producing the famous impression that the monument is floating. The effect explains its traditional name, the floating stone, without requiring any physical anomaly, but it does not explain why its makers designed the object to stand above a water-filled hollow in the first place. The central mystery is therefore not whether ancient people could carve stone. The surrounding Tatsuyama quarry complex contains abundant proof that communities in the region possessed an established stoneworking industry from the Kofun period onward. More than 100 quarry locations have been identified around Takasago, and Tatsuyama stone travelled far beyond the immediate landscape. Craftsmen cut it into sarcophagi during the Middle and Late Kofun period, while later builders used it for palace foundations and Buddhist architecture. Ishi no Hoden belongs to a landscape of skilled extraction rather than an isolated technological miracle, yet nothing else in that landscape matches its scale, form, or unfinished condition. The same evidence that demonstrates how it could have been carved also makes its unusual design harder to dismiss as ordinary quarrying. Its age remains uncertain because stone cannot normally be radiocarbon dated, and the monument preserves no inscription naming a ruler, patron, or workforce. The earliest surviving written reference appears in the Harima Fudoki, compiled around 713 to 717, proving that the stone existed by the early 8th century, but not revealing when work began. Archaeologists often place its creation in the late Kofun or Asuka period, particularly around the 6th or 7th century, because this was a time when monumental stone chambers, enormous sarcophagi, and increasingly ambitious state projects were being constructed in Western Japan. That estimate is based on historical and technological context, rather than a secure excavated layer directly associated with the carving. The monument could be older than the surviving record, but there is currently no scientific evidence supporting claims that it belongs to a remotely prehistoric or unknown civilization. Attempts to identify its function encounter an even greater absence of evidence. The block has been described as a tomb component, a monumental sarcophagus, the foundation of a stone building, a ritual object, or an abandoned architectural element. Its rear projection has sometimes been compared with the roof-like forms of certain ancient stone coffins, encouraging the theory that Ishi no Hoden was intended as an enormous funerary structure. Yet a sarcophagus normally requires a chamber or cavity for the deceased, and no confirmed burial space has been identified within the visible mass. Neither human remains nor funerary objects have established a mortuary purpose, while the surrounding basin does not resemble a completed tomb. Similarity of shape may indicate a shared architectural tradition, but it cannot by itself reveal what this object was supposed to become. The possibility of an unfinished monument appears stronger, because substantial parts retain the character of quarry work rather than final finishing. The lower attachment was never removed, the block was never transported, and no completed structure was built around it. Even so, The word unfinished only describes its condition. It does not explain the project. Workers had already removed a vast quantity of bedrock from the top, sides and rear, creating a confined space around an object weighing hundreds of tons. This was not an accidental fragment exposed after a few days of extraction. It represents extensive planning and coordinated labour carried far enough to define the monument's overall geometry. If the intention was to move it, the builders faced the problem of lowering, turning and transporting a mass far larger than most known Tatsuyama sarcophagi. If it was meant to remain where it stood, then the hidden support surrounding trench and collecting water may have been deliberate parts of the design rather than signs of abandonment. That uncertainty produces one of the monument's most important engineering questions. Quarry workers usually isolate stone in forms that can be removed efficiently, but Ishino-Hoden was shaped as a top-heavy mass inside a narrow excavation. Its rear projection increases the depth and complicates any hypothetical movement. Researchers can reconstruct the sequence by which channels were cut around the bedrock, yet the final operation remains unknown. The builders may have intended to separate the base and move the block, but no surviving ramp, hauling road, or prepared destination has been conclusively connected to it. Alternatively, they may have been carving a stationary sacred object, although no inscription or securely dated ritual deposit confirms that interpretation. The physical evidence allows both possibilities while proving neither. Questions also remain about the labour invested in the excavation. Popular accounts sometimes claim that thousands of tons of removed stone simply disappeared, but the mountain formed part of a long-used quarry district, so discarded or reusable material could have entered ordinary production over centuries. The missing spoil is not evidence of lost machinery. The more defensible mystery concerns the original work sequence. How many people participated? Which faces were cut first, whether the surrounding space was intentionally narrow, and whether an unseen flaw in the stone forced the project to stop. Geological fractures, changes in political authority, the death of a patron or the collapse of a labour organisation could all have ended construction without leaving a written explanation. Since the carving surface itself cannot record those social events, archaeology must infer them from a monument stripped of its original context. The water beneath the stone presents another unresolved distinction between natural circumstance and intentional design. Rain and groundwater collect in the depression, concealing the central support and strengthening the illusion of suspension. Later religious tradition incorporated this appearance into the identity of the shrine, but it is uncertain whether the earliest builders anticipated a permanent pool. The basin may originally have been a working trench that filled after the monument was abandoned, or the builders may have designed the stone to rise symbolically above water. Without an ancient drainage system, datable sediment sequence, or associated ritual material, the modern appearance cannot automatically be projected backward to the moment of construction. Stone spheres of Diquis, scattered across the Diquis Delta in southern Costa Rica, present one of archaeology's most enduring engineering puzzles. Hundreds of nearly perfect stone spheres lie across a tropical landscape, yet no surviving written record explains who designed them, how they were produced with such precision, or why an ancient society invested extraordinary effort into objects that appear to serve no obvious practical purpose. The modern story began during the late 1940s when workers employed by the United Fruit Company cleared dense rainforest to establish banana plantations in the Diquis Delta. Bulldozers exposed dozens of massive stone spheres buried beneath centuries of vegetation, while archaeologists soon recognized that these were not isolated curiosities, but part of an extensive prehistoric cultural landscape. Subsequent investigations led by Samuel K. Lothrop of Harvard University's Peabody Museum documented many of the discoveries, Although the opportunity to study countless spheres in their original positions had already been lost because heavy machinery had moved them before proper archaeological recording could begin, even today, despite decades of excavation, the discoveries continue to raise more questions than answers. Radiocarbon dating of associated archaeological deposits places the principal production of the spheres between approximately AD 600 and 1500 during the Chiriqui cultural tradition that flourished in southern Costa Rica before European contact. More than *300 spheres have now been recorded, ranging from only a few centimeters in diameter to over *2.5 meters with the largest weighing close to *, 15 metric tons *. Most were carved from granodiorite, an exceptionally hard, intrusive igneous rock originating in the foothills of the nearby Talamanca Mountains, while smaller examples were fashioned from gabbro or limestone. Those measurements alone reveal an astonishing investment of labour, but the greatest mystery emerges only after examining their geometry. The most difficult question confronting archaeologists is not why the spheres exist, but how prehistoric craftsmen achieved such remarkable accuracy without metal tools, precision measuring instruments, or written mathematical systems. Many of the best preserved examples approach an almost perfect spherical form, displaying consistent curvature across their surfaces that remains impressive even when evaluated using modern three-dimensional scanning technologies. Contrary to popular myths, not every sphere is flawless, and detailed digital surveys have shown that some possess slight irregularities caused by weathering or incomplete finishing. Even so, numerous specimens remain extraordinarily close to true spheres, despite having been produced centuries before precision engineering was thought possible in this region. Archaeologists generally propose that artisans first fractured large boulders, using repeated heating and rapid cooling, then shaped the stone with hammerstones, before gradually refining the surface through prolonged abrasion, using smaller stones, sand, and water. The hypothesis is physically plausible, yet no excavation has uncovered a complete workshop demonstrating every stage of production, nor have archaeologists recovered specialized templates, measuring devices, or experimental evidence proving that this method alone could repeatedly achieve the remarkable consistency visible across hundreds of enormous objects. The technological gap between what is theoretically possible and what has actually been demonstrated continues to define the central mystery of the stone spheres of Dikis. That uncertainty becomes even greater when attention shifts from manufacture to transportation. Geological analysis has traced many granodiorite spheres to quarries located in the Talamanca foothills. In some cases, *** 10 to more than 50 kilometers *** from where the finished monuments were eventually placed. Between those source outcrops and the archaeological sites stretches one of Central America's most demanding environments, consisting of dense tropical rainforest, rivers, marshlands, and seasonally flooded plains. The society responsible possessed neither wheeled vehicles nor draft animals capable of pulling multi-ton loads across such terrain. Yet some of the heaviest spheres ultimately reached elevated ridges, village plazas, and carefully prepared architectural settings, rather than remaining close to the quarries. Experimental archaeology suggests that large workforces using wooden rollers, sledges, ropes, and earthen ramps might have accomplished the task, but no preserved transport roads, engineered ramps, or hauling installations have been identified. The absence of direct archaeological evidence leaves the logistical achievement largely unexplained, especially considering that some individual stones weigh as much as a modern city bus. As excavations expanded, researchers discovered that the spheres were not always positioned randomly across the landscape. Several remained associated with ancient settlements, where they appeared in straight lines, triangular arrangements, rectangular groupings, or formal plazas. Such geometric placement immediately suggested deliberate planning rather than casual decoration. Unfortunately, the archaeological record had already suffered irreversible damage because countless spheres were relocated during agricultural development throughout the 20th century. Some became ornaments in private gardens, others were installed outside government buildings or hotels, and many disappeared entirely from their original contexts. Early field notes recorded alignments that seemed remarkably precise, yet later researchers often found only empty spaces where crucial evidence had once existed. Whether these arrangements expressed political authority, ceremonial organization, territorial boundaries, or sophisticated spatial planning, therefore, remains impossible to determine with confidence, because much of the contextual information vanished before systematic archaeological documentation became standard practice. The question of purpose has consequently become one of the longest-running debates in American archaeology. One interpretation proposes that the larger spheres symbolize the authority of elite families whose residences occupied the surrounding settlements. Another suggests that the monuments marked important ceremonial spaces where political gatherings reinforced social hierarchy. Some researchers have explored possible astronomical relationships, arguing that certain alignments may have referenced solar events or significant directions on the landscape, although current evidence remains insufficient to demonstrate intentional celestial observation. Others emphasize the symbolic significance of the sphere itself, noting that perfectly rounded forms frequently represented concepts of completeness, cosmic order, or sacred power in many ancient societies around the world. Every hypothesis possesses elements consistent with the available evidence, yet none explains every known site. The greatest obstacle is that the people who created the spheres left no surviving written language capable of revealing their intentions, while Spanish colonization during the 16th century rapidly transformed and ultimately dismantled the indigenous societies of the Diquis region before their traditions could be recorded in detail. Whatever meaning these monuments once carried disappeared together with the cultural knowledge required to interpret them. Adding another layer of uncertainty is the remarkable scale of investment represented by each sphere. Producing a monument weighing up to 15 tons required quarrying hard igneous rock, transporting it across difficult terrain, shaping it with extraordinary care, and finally positioning it within a carefully organized settlement. Such an undertaking demanded coordination, skilled labor, and substantial resources over extended periods. Yet, unlike defensive walls, irrigation systems, or monumental temples, the finished spheres provided no immediately obvious practical benefit. They were neither fortifications nor dwellings, neither agricultural tools nor sculpted representations of rulers or deities. Archaeology, therefore, confronts an unusual paradox: an enormous technological commitment devoted to creating objects whose primary function remains elusive. The more impressive the engineering becomes, the more difficult it is to explain the motivation behind it. Modern scientific research has revealed important details while leaving the central mystery unresolved. High-resolution 3D laser scanning has measured the spheres with remarkable precision. Petrographic analysis has confirmed the origin of the stone, and radiocarbon dating has refined the chronology of nearby settlements. UNESCO designated the pre-Columbian chiefdom settlements with stone spheres of the Diquis a World Heritage Site in 2014, yet archaeologists still cannot fully explain how the spheres were made, transported, or what they originally meant. In the province of Avila in central Spain, overlooking the Ambles Valley, lies Mesa de Miranda, an Iron Age hill fort whose surviving granite walls continue to raise engineering questions more than 2,000 years after they were built. Hidden among rugged uplands at an elevation of roughly 1,400 meters, this vast settlement appears at first to be another Celtic ruin. Yet behind its weathered stones stands a construction project whose precision, stability and scale seem unexpectedly advanced for a society working centuries before Roman domination of the Iberian Peninsula. Mesa de Miranda remained largely unknown outside the local region until systematic archaeological excavations began during the 20th century, particularly through the work of Spanish archaeologist Juan Cabrera-Guilo, and later investigations carried out by the University of Salamanca and regional heritage institutions. Excavations revealed that the site belonged to the Veternes, a Celtic-speaking people occupying Western Iberia between approximately the 5th and 1st centuries BC. Archaeological evidence indicates that the enclosed settlement covered nearly 30 hectares and was protected by almost 3 kilometers of defensive walls, making it one of the largest fortified veteran settlements ever identified. The enormous size of the enclosure immediately presents the first puzzle. Building nearly 3 kilometers of fortification was already an extraordinary undertaking, but the greater mystery lies in how the entire defensive system was planned across an irregular granite plateau. The walls do not simply follow the easiest route around the hill. Instead, they bend with remarkable consistency around natural ridges, cliffs, terraces, and steep slopes while preserving defensive continuity. Even with modern topographic mapping, designing such a layout requires careful surveying because every change in elevation alters sightlines, access routes, and structural loads. Archaeologists have found no evidence of written architectural plans, measuring instruments comparable to Roman surveying equipment, or standardized engineering manuals from the Veternes. Yet the overall geometry suggests that someone possessed a remarkably accurate understanding of terrain long before construction began. The greatest engineering mystery, however, lies within the walls themselves. Mesa de Miranda is built primarily with Cyclopean masonry, a construction technique that relies on massive granite blocks assembled without mortar. Although the term Cyclopean was coined much later by Greek observers who believed only mythical giants could move such stones, the technique appears throughout prehistoric Europe in several independent traditions. At Mesa de Miranda, the walls often measure between 3 and 5 meters thick, while their original height is estimated to have reached 6 to 8 meters in some sectors. Considering their total length, researchers estimate that tens of thousands of tons of granite were extracted, transported, positioned, and locked together with astonishing accuracy. Unlike later Roman masonry, these stones were rarely cut into regular rectangular blocks. Most preserve much of their natural shape, yet they fit together with surprising efficiency. Modern structural engineers describe this as a self-stabilizing dry stone system, where stability is achieved not by cement but by gravity, friction, and carefully distributed loads. Every irregular surface increases contact with neighboring stones, reducing movement while allowing microscopic adjustments during seasonal expansion and contraction. Instead of behaving like a rigid concrete wall that may crack under stress, the entire structure functions almost as a flexible mechanical assembly capable of absorbing gradual shifts in the ground. This characteristic explains why significant sections remain standing after more than 22 centuries despite repeated freeze-thaw cycles, earthquakes of low to moderate intensity, seasonal erosion, and continuous weathering. Granite itself possesses exceptional compressive strength, often exceeding 100 megapascals depending on mineral composition. But strong stone alone cannot explain the survival of such immense walls. Countless ancient granite structures have collapsed after losing internal stability. Mesa de Miranda did not simply rely on durable material. It relied on a construction philosophy that modern dry stone engineering increasingly recognizes as remarkably sophisticated. The question becomes far more difficult when one considers the practical process of assembly. Every irregular block possesses a unique center of gravity. If positioned incorrectly, even a slight imbalance could destabilize the courses above it. Builders therefore needed to predict how each stone would distribute its weight before lifting it into place. Across nearly 3 kilometers of fortification, that process had to be repeated thousands of times with extraordinary consistency. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that constructing stable dry stone walls requires experienced masons capable of mentally visualizing 3-dimensional load paths. Mesa de Miranda expands that challenge from individual buildings to an entire defensive landscape. Researchers also remain uncertain about the methods used to transport the granite. Many blocks weigh between 2 and 5 metric tons, with some likely exceeding that range. The nearest granite outcrops provided abundant material, but moving stones of this size uphill across uneven terrain without iron cranes, wheeled construction vehicles, or documented pulley systems demanded immense coordination. Proposed methods include timber rollers, sledges, rope made from plant fibers, teams of oxen, and earthen ramps. Each technique works in controlled experiments, yet no direct archaeological evidence identifies which solution was actually employed here. Even more intriguing, some stones occupy locations where steep gradients would have complicated every stage of transport. Equally impressive is the internal structure of the fortifications. Excavated sections reveal that the walls were not simple piles of stone. Large facing blocks enclosed a carefully packed interior core consisting of smaller stones and rubble. This composite design distributed pressure evenly across the wall, while minimizing empty spaces that could weaken the structure. Similar engineering principles appear centuries later in Roman fortifications, but the Vetans developed their own version independently. Such internal packing also improved drainage by allowing rainwater to filter gradually through the wall, instead of accumulating behind it, reducing hydrostatic pressure that commonly destroys ancient masonry. The placement of gateways demonstrates another level of strategic thinking. Rather than opening directly toward approaching visitors, entrances forced movement through narrow-angle passages where attackers would repeatedly expose their unshielded sides. Modern military historians describe comparable arrangements as creating controlled killing zones, because defenders positioned above could attack invaders trapped within confined approaches. The remarkable aspect is not simply the existence of defensive gateways, but their integration with the surrounding topography. Natural cliffs, steep slopes, and projecting walls combine into a single defensive system that appears carefully modeled around expected enemy movement rather than imposed upon the landscape afterward. One feature especially associated with Vetan settlements further strengthens this impression. Around vulnerable sectors, archaeologists uncovered extensive fields of upright pointed stones, known by the French term chevaux de frise. Hundreds of granite spikes projected from the ground at regular angles, forming an obstacle designed to disrupt advancing infantry and, more importantly, mounted cavalry. Similar defensive barriers appeared much later in medieval Europe. Yet, the Vetans implemented the concept centuries earlier. Their distribution was highly selective. Instead of surrounding the entire settlement, these stone fields protected only those sectors where approaching forces could realistically assemble, revealing a surprisingly detailed understanding of battlefield geometry. Modern technologies have added new layers to the investigation instead of closing the debate. High-resolution aerial photography, LiDAR surveys, photogrammetry, and digital terrain modeling reveal subtle geometric relationships invisible from ground level. These studies show that builders repeatedly selected the most structurally advantageous positions along natural bedrock, rather than following visually symmetrical layouts. The fortifications appear optimized to exploit geological stability while minimizing unnecessary construction volume, an approach entirely consistent with principles used in modern geotechnical engineering. Whether this knowledge resulted from generations of accumulated empirical observation or from specialized builders transmitting highly developed construction traditions remains unknown. Casinomegas is located beneath the quiet village of Chassenon in western France and represents one of the largest Roman monumental complexes ever built in Gaul. At first glance, it appears to be another provincial archaeological site, yet beneath its collapsed walls survives an engineering system so sophisticated that modern researchers are still reconstructing how it functioned almost 2,000 years ago. The ruins were already known to local inhabitants during the Middle Ages, when enormous Roman stones were reused in churches and nearby buildings. But the true scale of Casinomegas remained hidden until systematic excavations began during the 19th century and expanded dramatically through archaeological campaigns from the 1960s onward. Ground-penetrating surveys, laser scanning, architectural reconstruction and thermal simulations have since revealed that what once appeared to be scattered ruins actually belonged to one of the most ambitious bath complexes anywhere in the western provinces of the Roman Empire. The first mystery begins beneath the foundations rather than above them. Casinomegas was constructed directly on the fractured rocks of the Rocha Chouart impact structure, formed approximately 200 million years ago when an asteroid estimated at 1 to 1.5 kilometers in diameter struck what is now southwestern France. Instead of ordinary limestone, Roman builders encountered impact breccias, shattered crystalline rocks, and irregular geological layers produced by one of Europe's largest known meteorite impacts. Modern engineers normally regard fractured bedrock as difficult terrain for supporting extremely heavy masonry, because uneven settlement can crack vaults and walls over time. Yet the Roman architects covered this unstable geological platform with monumental buildings whose foundations have remained remarkably stable for nearly 20 centuries. Archaeologists still debate how Roman surveyors evaluated such unpredictable ground without modern geotechnical instruments, because no evidence survives describing how they selected precisely which fractured zones could safely bear thousands of tons of stone. The greatest engineering puzzle, however, lies beneath the floors rather than inside the walls. Casinomegas contains one of the largest surviving hypocore systems ever discovered in Western Europe, a heating network whose scale exceeds what many historians once believed possible for a provincial town. Instead of relying on fireplaces inside occupied rooms, enormous furnaces generated hot air that traveled through a labyrinth hidden beneath suspended floors. Hundreds of small brick pillars, known as pillae, supported thick pavements while leaving continuous cavities underneath. Heat circulated through these chambers before climbing inside hollow, ceramic wall flues, warming entire rooms from below and along their walls simultaneously. The principle itself is well understood, but the extraordinary dimensions of the Casinomegas installation continue to raise questions that remain only partially answered. The preserved bath complex occupies roughly 1.5 hectares, making it among the largest Roman thermal establishments outside Italy. Archaeological excavations have documented extensive furnace rooms, long underground heating corridors, multiple service passages, and dense forests of brick supports extending beneath vast areas of flooring. Maintaining comfortable temperatures across such an enormous building was not simply a matter of producing more fire. Different rooms demanded carefully controlled environments. The caldarium required temperatures that may have approached 50 degrees Celsius, while the tepidarium needed significantly lower heat, and the frigidarium had to remain relatively cool despite standing only meters away. Modern computational fluid dynamics has been applied to reconstruct airflow through surviving structures, yet no model has fully explained how Roman engineers balanced temperature, airflow velocity, pressure, and fuel efficiency across the entire complex without overheating some chambers, while leaving others cold. Even more remarkable is the apparent stability of this thermal network over centuries of operation. Every heating cycle subjected masonry to continuous expansion and contraction as temperatures fluctuated day after day. Such thermal stress normally produces fractures, particularly across large spans of stone flooring. Instead, much of the surviving substructure displays surprisingly limited structural deformation. Researchers suggest that the Romans carefully selected layered construction techniques combining stone foundations, mortar bedding, brick supports, suspended floors, and air cavities that distributed both mechanical loads and thermal expansion. The exact proportions of the mortars used throughout Casino Magus remain under study because chemical analyses indicate mixtures containing lime, crushed ceramics, and aggregates whose composition varies according to structural function. Some specialists believe these changing recipes were intentionally adapted to withstand repeated heating cycles, although no surviving Roman manual describes such engineering decisions in detail. The hidden passages beneath the baths introduce another mystery that rarely receives attention. These were not narrow crawl spaces built only for hot air circulation. Many corridors were large enough for workers to enter, remove accumulated ash, inspect furnaces, repair damaged supports, and regulate combustion without interrupting activity above. In effect, Roman engineers created an underground maintenance level, almost entirely concealed from bath visitors. This separation between public architecture and hidden technical infrastructure resembles concepts commonly associated with modern mechanical buildings rather than ancient civic monuments. The sophistication of this service network suggests that long-term maintenance had been incorporated into the original architectural design, rather than added later as an improvisation. Fuel consumption presents another unanswered question. Experimental reconstructions of Roman bath complexes indicate that installations of comparable size could require several tons of firewood each day to sustain operating temperatures, especially during colder seasons. Supplying such quantities continuously would have demanded organized forestry, transportation, storage facilities, trained furnace operators, and precise scheduling. Casino Magus was not Rome, Alexandria, or Carthage. It occupied a provincial landscape, making its enormous energy requirements increasingly difficult to reconcile with traditional assumptions about the settlement's size and economic importance. Some archaeologists argue that the complex served pilgrims, merchants, and travelers moving along major Roman roads rather than only local residents, while others suggest it represented a regional administrative center whose true population has been underestimated. Neither interpretation fully explains why such an exceptionally large thermal installation was constructed so far from the empire's largest urban centers. Water management forms another layer of uncertainty. Roman baths depended upon continuous supplies of clean water, while simultaneously removing enormous volumes of wastewater. Excavations have identified reservoirs, drainage channels, distribution conduits, and sophisticated sewer systems integrated throughout the complex. Nevertheless, parts of the hydraulic network remain missing, preventing researchers from reconstructing the complete circulation system. questions remain regarding the precise origin of the freshwater supply, the total daily volume delivered, and the hydraulic mechanisms that maintained sufficient pressure across different sections of the baths. Considering the immense quantities of heated water required every day, the incomplete preservation of this infrastructure leaves one of the most important engineering systems only partially understood. The visible ruins today represent only a fraction of the original monument because most vaults and upper walls collapsed long ago. Yet, surviving foundations demonstrate extraordinary precision in distributing loads across irregular bedrock. Large vaulted halls once rose above spaces now open to the sky, their immense weight transferred through carefully positioned walls and substructures that continue to stand despite centuries of weathering. Laser surveys have revealed geometric consistency across the remaining masonry, suggesting Roman builders achieved remarkable construction accuracy over a vast architectural footprint using surveying instruments far simpler than those available today. Osirion, Abydos, Egypt. Behind the decorated Temple of Seti lies a sunken monument whose age, design, and original purpose remain subjects of debate more than a century after its excavation. The structure emerged during excavations at Abydos in 1902 and 1903, when Margaret Murray, Hilda Petrie, and Flinders Petrie investigated ground behind the temple. Instead of another decorated chapel, they encountered passages descending toward a building buried far below the surrounding surface. Later clearance by Edouard Naville and Henri Frankfurt exposed a monumental central hall built from enormous blocks of red granite, sandstone and limestone. Frankfurt's detailed report, published in 1933, identified it as the cenotaph of Seti I, yet its appearance was so unlike the temple beside it that questions concerning its history began almost immediately. The deepest uncertainty concerns whether the Osirion was constructed together with Seti I's temple during the 13th century BCE, or whether the pharaoh incorporated an older sacred structure into his complex. Its floor lies roughly 8 meters below the level of the neighboring temple, creating the impression that the building belongs to a landscape that had already been buried before Seti's architects arrived. Its central chamber also rejects the visual language of the temple above. Seti's sanctuary is covered with finely carved reliefs, painted figures, hieroglyphic texts, and rows of carefully organized rooms. The Osirion is dominated instead by massive undecorated masonry, heavy granite pillars, broad stone lintels, and a severe geometry resembling some monuments of the Old Kingdom more than 1,000 years earlier. That contrast produced the enduring claim that the Osirion may predate Seti I. The idea is visually persuasive, but archaeological evidence makes the problem more complicated. Inscriptions, construction marks, and repeated royal names connect the monument directly with Seti. One ancient name recorded for the structure can be translated approximately as Setith is beneficial to Osiris, while cartouches and religious texts appear in chambers belonging to the complex. Egyptologist Peter Brand therefore argued that the monument can be dated confidently to Seti's reign. Its position also follows the central axis of the temple so precisely that accidental alignment is extremely unlikely. These details support a unified building program rather than the later discovery of an unrelated ruin. Yet those arguments do not explain why Seti's builders created a monument that deliberately looked archaic, placed it so far below the temple, and surrounded its central platform with channels that evoked an island rising from water. If it was not genuinely ancient when Seti found it, then it was designed to appear ancient. This may have been intentional theology rather than evidence of a forgotten civilization. Abydos was one of Egypt's most sacred places, closely associated with Osiris, death, regeneration, and the origins of kingship. By constructing a subterranean stone chamber in a style recalling Egypt's remote past, Seti may have been manufacturing sacred antiquity, giving his monument the authority of a primordial structure even when it was newly built. The engineering required to create that effect remains extraordinary. The central hall contains 10 massive red granite supports arranged around a raised rectangular island. Heavy granite architraves once crossed above them, while surrounding walls and chambers were constructed from large blocks of sandstone and limestone. The granite had to be quarried in the Aswan region, hundreds of kilometers south of Abydos, transported north along the Nile, moved inland, and lowered into a deep excavation. Archaeologists understand the general technologies available to Egyptian builders: stone sledges, timber, ropes, prepared ramps, river barges, pounding stones, copper tools, and abrasive quartz sand. What cannot be reconstructed with certainty is the exact sequence used at this particular site, because no building ramp, transport record, engineering plan, or complete construction yard has survived. The depth of the monument intensified every stage of the operation. Builders were not simply placing heavy columns on an open foundation. They had to excavate a huge pit, stabilize its sides, prepare a level base, deliver stone into the depression, position the supports, raise the lintels, construct surrounding walls, and finally cover much of the building beneath an artificial mound. Frankfurt concluded that the Osirion was originally subterranean, with only its mound and perhaps limited architectural features visible above ground. Its present open appearance is deceptive because much of the roof has disappeared. The monument seen today is therefore the exposed skeleton of a structure once intended to feel enclosed, dark, and separated from the ordinary world. Water adds another unresolved dimension. The central island is bordered by deep channels, and groundwater now occupies much of the lower structure. Modern geophysical research around the site has identified buried geological pathways capable of carrying groundwater from the direction of the Nile, helping explain why flooding continues. This does not prove that the present water level existed when the monument was built, but water was almost certainly part of the intended symbolism. In Egyptian cosmology, the first land emerged from none, the limitless primeval waters that existed before creation. The Osirion's raised island may have represented this first mound, while the deceased king identified with Osiris participated in a cycle of burial, regeneration, and cosmic renewal. Even so, archaeologists still debate how literally the water system should be interpreted. The channels may have been deliberately filled during ceremonies, supplied by groundwater, connected to a basin, or left mostly dry while functioning as an architectural image of the primeval ocean. No intact hydraulic installation has been recovered that explains precisely how water entered, circulated, and left the monument during the New Kingdom. Today's flooding also limits access, conceals lower masonry, deposits sediment, and makes it difficult to separate ancient water management from later geological change. The feature that gives the Osirion its strongest symbolic meaning is therefore also one of the greatest obstacles to understanding its original operation. Its function is equally difficult to define. The monument is commonly called a cenotaph of Seti I, meaning a symbolic tomb rather than the place where his body was buried. Seti's actual tomb, KV-17, was cut into the Valley of the Kings at Thebes, more than 100 kilometers away. At Abydos, the king may have created a second sacred burial landscape in which he could be ritually united with Osiris. The texts preserved in the Osirion include complex cosmographic compositions concerned with the underworld, the sun's nocturnal journey, creation, death, and rebirth. Some appear among the earlier surviving examples of religious material later developed in royal tombs, showing that the monument was not an empty mass of stone but an experimental centre of funerary theology. However, calling it a cenotaph does not fully explain what occurred inside. Archaeologists cannot identify the complete sequence of ceremonies, determine who was permitted to enter, establish whether a symbolic body or statue occupied the central island, or prove how frequently rituals were performed. The building may have served simultaneously as a memorial to Seti, a tomb of Osiris, a stage for regeneration rites, and a monumental model of creation. Modern categories such as temple, tomb, and cenotaph may be too narrow for a structure designed to combine several sacred realities within a single subterranean space. On a narrow Atlantic headland overlooking the Bay of Biscay in Fuzuro, Galicia, northwestern Spain, the remains of a small Iron Age settlement challenge one of archaeology's oldest assumptions, that advanced engineering belonged only to the great civilizations of the ancient world. Hidden above cliffs battered by relentless ocean storms, Castro de Fuzuro preserves evidence of builders who mastered drainage, structural planning, and environmental adaptation, with techniques whose underlying design principles are still only partly understood. The site remained unnoticed by modern archaeology until the early 20th century, but systematic excavations carried out from the 1960s onward uncovered an exceptionally well-preserved coastal castro, occupied between approximately the 1st century BC and the 2nd century AD. Unlike most fortified settlements of northwestern Iberia, many of which survive only as buried foundations, Castro de Fuzuro exposed complete house plans, paved streets, workshops, drainage features, and defensive structures, providing an unusually detailed picture of daily engineering during the transition from indigenous Castro culture to Roman influence. Archaeological investigations conducted by the Junta de Galicia indicate that roughly 9 architectural structures have been documented within an excavated area of only about 400 square meters, revealing a surprisingly organized settlement despite its modest size. The first feature that immediately separates Castro de Fuzuro from countless other Iron Age villages is not its walls or its houses, but the remarkable way it controls water. The settlement occupies one of the least forgiving locations imaginable for permanent habitation. Galicia receives between 1,000 and 2,000 millimeters of rainfall annually, depending on elevation, while Atlantic storms repeatedly drive rain horizontally across the exposed cliffs. Salt spray, strong winds, and continuous moisture normally accelerate structural decay, yet the excavated buildings show clear evidence that standing water inside domestic spaces was systematically prevented. Rather than relying on underground sewer systems like those developed in Roman cities, the builders transformed the entire settlement itself into a gravity-powered hydraulic network. Individual houses were intentionally raised slightly above adjacent open spaces, creating subtle elevation differences that are barely noticeable today but sufficient to direct runoff away from living areas. Stone-paved floors were laid with carefully calculated gradients, allowing rainwater to travel naturally toward exterior circulation zones before leaving the settlement altogether. Narrow gaps between walls acted as controlled drainage passages, while exterior courtyards functioned as intermediate collection surfaces instead of allowing water to accumulate against foundations. None of these elements appears accidental. Each building contributes to a larger hydraulic pattern that only becomes visible when the settlement is viewed as an integrated engineering system rather than as isolated houses. What makes this achievement particularly difficult to explain is the apparent precision with which these gradients were established. Modern engineers accomplish comparable work using laser levels, surveying instruments, and mathematical calculations. The inhabitants of Castro de Fuzuro possess none of these technologies. No measuring devices, construction plans, or written architectural manuals have ever been recovered from the site. Yet the surviving foundations indicate that builders repeatedly reproduced effective drainage geometry across multiple structures. Even an error of only a few centimeters in floor elevation could have caused water to flow back into houses during heavy Atlantic rainfall. But archaeological evidence suggests the system performed successfully for generations. Whether these builders relied upon sophisticated empirical surveying techniques, inherited construction traditions refined over centuries, or some now lost method of establishing consistent gradients remains unknown. Equally intriguing is the choice of construction material. Most monumental architecture across the Roman world depended heavily upon massive limestone or granite blocks. Yet Castro de Fazuro was built largely with locally available slate. At first glance, this appears entirely practical, but slate presents engineering difficulties of its own. Because it naturally splits along thin planes, improperly oriented blocks can fracture under repeated loading or weather exposure. The walls surviving at Fazuro demonstrate that builders consistently place the stone in orientations, maximizing compressive strength while minimizing delamination. Such knowledge implies a detailed practical understanding of rock mechanics acquired without geological science. Archaeologists still debate whether this expertise developed through generations of accumulated experience or represented standardized construction practices transmitted among specialized builders throughout the Castro culture. The organization of the settlement itself also reveals planning far beyond what its modest dimensions might suggest. Excavated structures share walls, reuse earlier foundations, and maintain orderly circulation routes, despite being constructed during different occupational phases. Instead of expanding randomly as families increased, the community appears to have followed spatial rules that balance domestic needs, workshops, access routes, and drainage simultaneously. This level of coordinated planning resembles principles seen in far larger Roman settlements, yet Castro de Fazuro never reached urban scale. The settlement demonstrates that sophisticated planning does not necessarily require monumental size. Evidence of metallurgy introduces another engineering question. Excavations identified a workshop containing slag deposits, combustion installations, and stone-built working areas associated with high-temperature metal production. Producing iron requires sustained temperatures exceeding approximately 1,100 degrees Celsius, while efficient bloomery furnaces depend upon carefully controlled airflow. Locating such activity immediately beside the Atlantic coast seems counterintuitive because humid marine air and salt-laden winds generally complicate combustion and accelerate corrosion. Some researchers have suggested that the prevailing coastal winds may actually have provided a natural source of forced ventilation, reducing the labor required to operate bellows continuously. Although no surviving furnace allows this hypothesis to be tested directly, the possibility that local wind conditions became an intentional component of metallurgical engineering remains an intriguing unanswered question. Defensive planning demonstrates the same philosophy. Castro de Fazuro occupies a rocky promontory where steep cliffs naturally protect most approaches. Rather than investing enormous labor constructing continuous fortification walls around the entire settlement, builders concentrated defensive works only where the terrain remained vulnerable. Earthworks and walls strengthened the accessible landward side, while the Atlantic itself became an integral component of the defensive system. Modern military engineers describe this approach as force multiplication through terrain exploitation, yet its principles were clearly understood here nearly 2,000 years ago. Every meter of unnecessary wall represented labor saved without reducing security. Perhaps the most overlooked engineering mystery concerns survival itself. The Atlantic coastline of Galicia experiences continuous erosion driven by waves, rainfall, salt crystallization, and seasonal temperature fluctuations. Geological studies estimate that marine cliff retreat, although highly variable, gradually removes sections of coastline over centuries. Despite occupying the edge of an exposed headland, substantial portions of Castro de Fazuro remain remarkably intact after nearly 2 millennia. Some sectors have undoubtedly disappeared into the sea, yet the preserved core suggests that the original builders deliberately selected one of the most stable bedrock platforms available. Whether this choice resulted from careful observation of geological stability over generations or from practical trial and error can no longer be determined, but the accuracy of that decision continues to protect the settlement today. Marcahuasi Stone Forest, rising almost 4,000 meters above sea level in Peru's Andes, presents one of archaeology's most stubborn unanswered questions. Across a granite plateau covering roughly 4 square kilometers, enormous stone formations appear to resemble human faces, animals, and monuments with such uncanny precision that researchers still cannot fully determine where natural geology ends and possible human intervention begins. The modern story of Marcahuasi began in the middle of the 20th century when Peruvian explorer Daniel Russo systematically documented the plateau after local shepherds had long known of its strange rocks. His surveys and photographs introduced the site to a wider scientific audience. But instead of settling the debate, they triggered decades of disagreement between archaeologists, geologists, and anthropologists. Field investigations confirmed that the plateau contains archaeological remains associated primarily with the Huanca culture and later Inca occupation. Yet, none of those discoveries explain the extraordinary granite formations dominating the landscape. More than 70 years after the first detailed surveys, the central mystery remains remarkably unchanged. Everything begins with the gigantic faces. Some rise more than 20 meters above the surrounding terrain, while the largest formations approach 30 meters in height. Unlike carved statues whose edges clearly preserve marks of chisels or hammerstones, these immense figures exist in an uncomfortable middle ground. Geologists argue that the plateau consists mainly of fractured granodiorite and granite, exposed to millions of years of weathering. Water entered natural joints, daily temperature changes widened microscopic cracks, and erosion gradually sculpted isolated pillars and rounded surfaces. Such processes are well understood throughout the Andes, yet they do not fully explain why several formations possess proportions resembling carefully designed human profiles viewed from remarkably specific angles. The most famous example is commonly called the Monument to Humanity. Standing before it at one position reveals what appears to be a monumental human face, but moving only a short distance or waiting until the late afternoon transforms the same rock into multiple completely different faces created solely by changing shadows. Researchers describe this as an interaction between complex three-dimensional geometry, solar illumination, and pareidolia, the neurological tendency of the human brain to recognize familiar patterns, especially faces, within random shapes. Pareidolia certainly explains why people perceive images inside clouds or mountain cliffs, yet Marcahuasi pushes that explanation to an unusual limit because the apparent sculptures are exceptionally large, unusually consistent, and concentrated within a relatively small plateau. Archaeology, therefore, faces a question that geology alone cannot completely answer. Were these formations left entirely untouched, or did ancient inhabitants subtly modify naturally weathered rock until they produced recognizable figures without leaving obvious tool marks? That uncertainty becomes even greater because the plateau contains far more than a single convincing formation. Visitors and researchers have identified rocks resembling condors, llamas, turtles, monkeys, lions, frogs, and numerous human heads. Individual interpretations differ, but the concentration itself remains remarkable. If every figure results entirely from coincidence, Marcahuasi represents one of the most extraordinary natural collections of recognizable rock forms anywhere in the Andes. If even a fraction were intentionally enhanced, the implications for understanding prehistoric landscape modification would be significant. Despite repeated examinations, archaeologists have never recovered convincing evidence of large-scale sculpting, while geologists likewise cannot demonstrate with certainty that every apparent figure developed without human influence. The debate therefore survives because neither discipline possesses evidence strong enough to eliminate the other's possibility. The archaeological remains scattered across the plateau deepen the mystery instead of resolving it. Stone terraces, stairways, retaining walls, leveled platforms and ceremonial spaces indicate that ancient communities repeatedly occupied this high-altitude environment despite its harsh climate. At elevations approaching 4,000 meters, temperatures fluctuate dramatically between day and night. Oxygen levels are substantially lower than at sea level, and agriculture becomes increasingly difficult. Constructing ceremonial or residential spaces under such conditions required planning, labor, and long-term commitment. Excavations have associated much of this occupation with the Huanca people before the Inca incorporated the region into their expanding empire, yet no surviving tradition or written source attributes the remarkable stone faces to either culture. This absence of cultural attribution creates another unresolved archaeological problem. Ancient civilizations throughout Peru left unmistakable signatures in architecture, ceramics, textiles, and stone carving. At Marcahuasi, however, no quarrying debris, unfinished sculptures, discarded carving tools, or workshops corresponding to monumental rock modification have ever been identified. If prehistoric builders intentionally shaped the formations, they left almost no technological evidence behind. If they did not, then generations of Andean communities deliberately established ceremonial activity within a naturally occurring landscape already possessing astonishing visual characteristics. Either conclusion raises difficult questions that archaeology has not answered satisfactorily. Adding another layer of complexity is the peculiar relationship between movement, perspective, and perception across the plateau. Many formations reveal recognizable images only from carefully defined viewpoints. Walking a few meters in either direction often causes an apparently perfect face to dissolve into an ordinary weathered outcrop, while another hidden profile suddenly emerges elsewhere. Modern researchers studying visual cognition recognize this phenomenon as anamorphic perception, in which three-dimensional geometry produces dramatically different images depending upon the observer's position. The scientific explanation describes how the illusion works, but it does not determine whether ancient inhabitants intentionally recognized and perhaps enhanced these optical effects thousands of years ago. Without direct evidence of carving, archaeology cannot distinguish deliberate artistic planning from extraordinarily fortunate geology. Because of these unanswered questions, some investigators explored whether the plateau also possessed astronomical significance. Several prominent rock alignments appear to correspond approximately with sunrise or sunset during particular seasons, encouraging suggestions that Marcahuasi functioned partly as a ceremonial observation center. Such proposals remain controversial because statistically meaningful, astronomical alignments are difficult to establish without associated architectural planning or written records. Unlike confirmed Andean observatories where repeated geometric patterns strengthen astronomical interpretations, Marcahuasi has produced no consensus demonstrating that its dramatic landscape was intentionally organized around celestial events. The possibility remains open, but the available evidence remains insufficient. Scientific studies increasingly emphasize geology, geomorphology, and landscape archaeology rather than sensational explanations. Remote sensing, detailed topographic mapping, drone photography, and digital terrain modeling have improved understanding of fracture networks across the plateau, showing how natural weathering exploited structural weaknesses within the granite over immense spans of geological time. Those findings strongly support a natural origin for the rock masses themselves. Yet even the most sophisticated three-dimensional models cannot answer whether prehistoric communities selectively modified existing formations whose shapes already suggested recognizable figures. That narrow but crucial distinction continues to separate competing interpretations. The Kaimanawa Wall stands within dense forest south of Lake Taupo on New Zealand's North Island, where an exposed rock face appears to have been assembled from enormous rectangular blocks. Although local foresters and residents had known about the formation earlier, it attracted international attention in the mid-1990s after New Zealand researcher Barry Brailsford and American alternative history writer David Hatcher Childress examined it and argued that its geometric surface might represent the remains of a human-built megalithic structure. Their claim transformed an obscure volcanic outcrop into a dispute capable of challenging the accepted chronology of human settlement in New Zealand. The visible section resembles several courses of masonry extending across the slope. Horizontal fractures divide the rock into broad layers, while vertical cracks break those layers into shapes that can look remarkably similar to fitted stone blocks. Some exposed faces appear almost flat, several intersections approach right angles, and vegetation conceals the continuation of the formation beneath the surrounding soil. From certain viewing positions, the surface looks less like a broken cliff than the outer wall of a buried structure whose upper levels have disappeared into the hillside. That appearance created the central controversy. Brailsford and Childress argued that the arrangement was too regular to be accidental, and suggested that the wall could predate the arrival of the ancestors of Maori. Under the archaeological chronology supported by current evidence, East Polynesian settlers reached New Zealand during the late 13th century, with permanent settlement developing rapidly afterward. A genuinely ancient stone monument beneath the Kaimanawa forest would therefore require either an unexpectedly early Polynesian presence or an unidentified population reaching the islands before them. Either possibility would alter one of the most intensively studied migration histories in the Pacific. The proposal became especially provocative because monumental block masonry is not characteristic of known prehistoric construction in New Zealand. Maori communities created fortified PA, terraces, storage pits, houses, defensive earthworks, and carefully engineered landscapes. But no securely dated Maori site contains masonry resembling the supposed wall. Supporters interpreted this absence as evidence that the builders belonged to another culture. Archaeologists interpreted it differently. If an unknown society had quarried, shaped, and positioned such large stones, it should also have left tools, occupation deposits, food remains, hearths, paths, quarries, or comparable structures elsewhere. None of that evidence has been recovered from the Kaimanawa formation. No associated artifact assemblage has established human construction. No buried cultural layer has produced a date, and no tool marks have been demonstrated on the exposed surfaces. There is also no verified foundation trench, prepared platform, or construction debris surrounding the supposed blocks. These absences do not mathematically prove that people never modified the site, but they leave the human-built interpretation without the normal archaeological evidence required to identify a monument. The geological explanation begins with an eruption far older than any possible human occupation of New Zealand. The formation consists of rangitaiki ignimbrita, welded volcanic material produced approximately 330,000 years ago within the Taupo volcanic zone. Ignimbrite forms when immense pyroclastic currents of hot ash, gas and fragmented rock travel outward from an explosive eruption and accumulate in thick deposits. While still hot, the particles can weld together into a dense mass that later behaves like solid rock. Ignimbrite sheets in the central North Island can reach enormous thicknesses and dominate entire plateau landscapes around the volcanic zone. As the deposit cooled and contracted, internal stress generated fractures. Cooling joints commonly develop in roughly vertical and horizontal directions, especially where the rock contains differences in density, temperature, or welding. Erosion then exploits those fractures, removing weaker material and exposing rows of apparently separate blocks. Similar processes can create natural columns, pavements, and wall-like cliffs, whose geometry looks deliberately engineered, even though no stone was ever quarried or moved. Geologist Peter Wood of the former Institute of Geological and Nuclear Sciences and archaeologist Neville Ritchie inspected the Kaimanawa exposure during the height of the controversy. Their observations supported a natural origin. Ritchie noted that the supposed courses were not consistently level, the vertical divisions were not truly perpendicular, and the shapes became less regular when examined closely rather than through selected photographs. More importantly, small irregularities on opposite sides of fractures appeared to match. A projection on one surface corresponded with a depression on the neighbouring surface, indicating that both sides had once formed a continuous mass before the rock split apart. Carefully fitted masonry usually shows separate stones shaped to meet one another. Matching fracture surfaces instead reveal a single body of rock, divided by natural stress. The formation's apparent precision is also affected by perspective. Soil and moss hide the lower edges, preventing observers from seeing whether the supposed blocks continue independently below ground. Weathering emphasizes the deepest fractures while obscuring smaller cracks, producing a simplified pattern of large rectangles. Photographs taken directly in front of the exposure compress its uneven depth and make separate surfaces appear aligned. Once the surrounding outcrop, loose fragments and irregular jointing are included. The structure resembles fractured ignimbrite more closely than organized architecture. Yet one unresolved demand has kept the controversy alive. Why not excavate the base and settle the matter directly? Supporters of the artificial wall hypothesis have repeatedly argued that only excavation could reveal whether the visible face continues downward as stacked blocks or merges into unbroken bedrock. They suggest that soil may conceal foundations, additional courses, or cultural material capable of identifying builders. Because no extensive archaeological excavation has exposed the entire base, the buried geometry has remained central to alternative interpretations. Archaeologists answer that excavation is not automatically required whenever natural rock resembles construction. Fieldwork is destructive, costly, and normally justified by evidence indicating archaeological potential. At Kaimanawa, geological inspection already identified the material, the fracture process, and matching surfaces consistent with an intact ignimbrite outcrop. Digging beside it would not change the volcanic age of the rock and would only demonstrate human construction if it uncovered unmistakable modification or associated cultural deposits. So far, surface examination has provided no compelling archaeological signal demanding a major excavation. The lack of excavation nevertheless creates a narrow space between what has been strongly explained and what has been physically exposed. Geological evidence can account for the wall-like pattern, but only complete subsurface examination could display every buried connection. This distinction is often exaggerated into a claim that scientists remain unable to explain the site. In reality, the scientific interpretation is highly consistent. The Kaimanawa Wall is a naturally jointed volcanic outcrop. What remains uncertain is not the basic geological mechanism, but whether people ever interacted with, altered, or assigned significance to the formation after it appeared in the landscape. That possibility is more credible than the idea of an entirely constructed megalithic wall, although it also lacks direct evidence. Human communities frequently incorporated unusual natural formations into ritual landscapes without building them from the ground up. A naturally fractured cliff could have been visited, cleared, marked, or used as a territorial reference. Such activity might leave only subtle traces, especially in a wet forest environment where organic material decomposes and volcanic soils are repeatedly disturbed by roots, erosion, and later land use. Without excavation, dating samples, or diagnostic artifacts, even limited human modification cannot be completely excluded. Located in the forests of southwestern Georgia, United States, Kolomoki Mounds appears at first to be nothing more than a cluster of grassy hills. Yet beneath those quiet earthworks lies one of the largest ceremonial centers ever constructed in eastern North America. A place where thousands of people reshaped an entire landscape nearly 16 centuries ago without metal tools, wheeled transport, or written engineering manuals, leaving behind geometric precision and astronomical knowledge that continue to challenge archaeologists. The existence of Kolomoki first attracted scholarly attention during the 19th century, but systematic excavations led by archaeologist William Sears between 1948 and 1953 transformed it from an overlooked mound complex into one of the most significant archaeological sites of the Woodland period. Radiocarbon dating, ceramic analysis, and stratigraphic studies indicate that the main construction phase occurred between approximately 350 and 600 AD, when the site covered more than 2 square kilometers and served as a major ceremonial center for communities spread across the lower Chattahoochee Valley. What immediately separates Kolomoki from hundreds of other mound sites is not simply its scale, but its extraordinary planning. 7 major platform and burial mounds were positioned around an immense central plaza, with several smaller mounds completing a layout that appears intentional rather than organic. Survey measurements reveal remarkably consistent spatial relationships extending across several hundred meters. Achieving that level of alignment required far more than simply piling soil into hills. Every platform had to maintain controlled elevation, stable slopes, and carefully defined boundaries over terrain that naturally rises and falls. Modern engineers would rely on optical instruments, benchmarks, and repeated topographic measurements to accomplish such work, yet no evidence has been found for comparable surveying technology. Archaeologists continue to debate whether the builders employed sophisticated rope-based geometry, astronomical references, or surveying methods that disappeared without leaving recognizable tools. Even more remarkable is the sheer volume of earth that had to be moved. Estimates suggest that the largest mounds collectively required between 200,000 and 250,000 cubic meters of soil, representing well over 300,000 metric tons of material transported entirely by human labor. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that a single woven basket typically carried only 20 to 30 kilograms of earth. At that rate, constructing the complex would have required millions of individual transport cycles. Such numbers imply years, perhaps decades, of coordinated labor involving hundreds or even thousands of workers, yet excavations have uncovered no evidence for an empire, military administration, or centralized bureaucracy capable of enforcing projects on this scale. The engineering survived, but the organizational system behind it vanished completely. Excavations inside the mounds reveal another technical puzzle hidden beneath the surface. Rather than consisting of randomly dumped soil, the earthworks were built from repeated layers of clay, sandy loam, and compact sediments placed in deliberate sequences. geotechnical studies indicate that alternating these materials improves drainage, while reducing internal deformation caused by seasonal moisture changes. Some layers appear intentionally compacted before additional fill was added above them, producing structures that have remained recognizable for nearly 16 centuries despite intense rainfall, root penetration, biological activity, and repeated freeze-thaw cycles. Modern soil mechanics explains why such layering works, but it does not explain how prehistoric builders discovered these principles through observation alone, or maintained consistent construction standards generation after generation. The greatest mystery, however, stands inside what archaeologists designate as Mound E, where a discovery made during Sears excavations sparked one of the longest-running debates in North American archaeology. Beneath the mound, researchers uncovered a circular arrangement of post holes, unlike those associated with ordinary buildings. Sears proposed that these wooden posts once formed a solar observatory capable of tracking the annual movement of sunrise across the horizon. According to his reconstruction, an observer standing at a designated viewing point would see the rising sun align with specific posts during the summer solstice, winter solstice, and the spring and autumn equinoxes. If correct, the arrangement transformed an ordinary ceremonial structure into a sophisticated astronomical instrument capable of marking the changing seasons with surprising precision. This interpretation immediately raised difficult questions because the geometry is not impossible by accident. The sun's rising position shifts by nearly 47 degrees along the horizon over the course of a year at Kolomoki's latitude, reaching its northernmost and southernmost extremes only during the solstices before reversing direction. Identifying those turning points requires continuous observations extending over many annual cycles. A single year is insufficient because atmospheric refraction, weather conditions, and local horizon irregularities introduce observational errors. Ancient observers would have needed decades of repeated measurements before confidently identifying the exact limits of the solar cycle. Such long-term astronomical recording implies an institutional tradition capable of preserving observations across generations, yet no written records exist to explain how this knowledge was transmitted. Later researchers revisited Sears' hypothesis using improved surveying equipment and computer simulations. Some concluded that several alignments remained statistically meaningful, while others argued that reconstruction uncertainties made definitive conclusions impossible because many original wooden posts had decayed long before excavation. Even slight shifts of a few centimeters in reconstructed post positions can alter apparent alignments by several degrees across distant horizons. Critics therefore caution against overstating the astronomical evidence, while supporters argue that the overall pattern exceeds what random placement would produce. More than half a century after the proposal was first published, neither side has completely resolved the debate, making Kolomoki one of the rare archaeological sites where the central question remains genuinely open rather than simply romantic speculation. Regardless of whether every proposed alignment proves correct, the builders clearly demonstrated a deep awareness of celestial cycles. Several mound axes and plaza orientations differ systematically from the surrounding landscape, instead of simply following convenient topography. Researchers have suggested that these orientations may relate to sunrise positions, seasonal ceremonies, or agricultural calendars that synchronized planting and harvesting with predictable solar events. Such interpretations remain hypotheses, yet they illustrate how architecture, ritual, and astronomy may have formed a single integrated system rather than independent activities. The precision of the landscape becomes even more intriguing when viewed from above. Modern aerial photography and LiDAR mapping reveal subtle geometric relationships almost impossible to recognize from ground level. The builders maintained broad open spaces between major earthworks, preserving uninterrupted sightlines across the central plaza. Those clear visual corridors would have been essential if observations depended on watching the sun rise against distant horizon markers. Whether intentional or coincidental, the spatial organization repeatedly favors visibility over convenience, suggesting that empty space itself formed part of the site's design. Kolomoki also raises unanswered questions about prehistoric mathematics. Constructing symmetrical platforms hundreds of meters apart while preserving consistent orientation requires practical understanding of distance measurement, angle estimation, and geometric planning. Unlike stone architecture, where errors can often be corrected block by block, massive earthen monuments become increasingly difficult to reshape once thousands of tons of soil have been deposited. Mistakes made early in construction would have multiplied as each additional layer was added. The finished earthworks show surprisingly little evidence of such cumulative errors, implying careful planning before construction even began. Do you think Mound E was truly an ancient solar observatory, or does Kolomoki still hide an even greater engineering secret? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Castellar de Meca sits on a rocky plateau overlooking the valleys of eastern Spain, near modern-day Ayora in the province of Valencia, and at first glance it appears to be little more than a forgotten hilltop settlement. Yet when archaeologists began studying the site in detail, they realized they were looking at something far more extraordinary. Spread across roughly 10 hectares and occupied primarily during the Iberian period, between the 5th and 1st centuries BCE, the settlement preserves one of the most unusual examples of ancient engineering in Western Europe. Unlike many ancient cities where walls and buildings dominate the landscape, Castellar de Meca's greatest achievement lies in the mountain itself. Roads, reservoirs, storage areas, drainage systems, and defensive features were carved directly into solid bedrock, creating a technological landscape whose full purpose and construction methods remain only partially understood. The discovery of the site did not immediately reveal its significance. Early investigators focused on visible structures and defensive walls, assuming Castellar de Meca was simply another fortified Iberian settlement. Only later did systematic surveys reveal the true scale of the engineering works. Researchers found an extensive network of roads cut directly into limestone, some preserving wheel ruts so deep and regular that they remain visible more than 2,000 years later. These features transformed Castellar de Meca from an archaeological curiosity into one of the most important examples of ancient landscape engineering in the Iberian Peninsula. The most famous mystery concerns the road system itself. Throughout the settlement, deep parallel grooves cut into bedrock mark the paths once travelled by carts. Some ruts exceed 0.5 meter in depth. Archaeologists generally interpret them as the result of centuries of traffic, yet this explanation raises difficult questions. In many locations, the grooves appear remarkably regular, maintaining consistent spacing and alignment across uneven terrain. Such precision suggests that at least portions of the network may have been intentionally engineered, rather than simply worn into existence through repeated use. If these routes were deliberately planned, the implications are significant. Ancient engineers would have needed to calculate gradients, turning radii, drainage requirements, and traffic flow long before Roman road building techniques became dominant in the region. The challenge becomes even more impressive when considering the terrain. Castellar de Meca sits atop a naturally defensive mountain environment where movement is constrained by steep slopes and exposed rock surfaces. Designing a transportation system capable of moving goods efficiently through such conditions would have required sophisticated practical knowledge of surveying and logistics. Comparisons with other ancient engineering centres highlight the puzzle. At Petra in Jordan, Nabatean engineers carved roads, water channels, and monumental facades directly into sandstone cliffs. At Machu Picchu in Peru, Inca builders reshaped entire mountainsides through terracing and carefully planned pathways. Castelar de Meca operated on a smaller scale, yet the underlying challenge was similar. In each case, engineers chose not merely to build upon a landscape, but to transform the landscape itself into an integrated technological system. Water management introduces another layer of mystery. The settlement occupies a high rocky plateau where access to permanent freshwater sources would have been limited. Yet archaeologists have documented numerous cisterns, reservoirs, channels, and collection basins carved directly into the bedrock. These installations were designed to capture and store seasonal rainfall, creating a sustainable water supply capable of supporting a substantial population. What remains uncertain is how the system was planned. Effective rainwater harvesting requires careful calculations involving catchment areas, seasonal precipitation patterns, storage capacity, evaporation rates, and overflow management. Modern hydrological studies demonstrate that even small errors in gradient can significantly reduce collection efficiency. Nevertheless, many of the reservoirs at Castelar de Meca continue to function today, demonstrating a level of engineering durability rarely associated with Iron Age societies. This raises an important question. How much mathematical and environmental knowledge did the builders possess? No surviving Iberian engineering manuals explain the design process. Archaeologists can measure the structures, estimate capacities, and reconstruct water flows, but the intellectual framework behind the system remains invisible. The engineers themselves left almost no written record explaining how these solutions were developed. Equally intriguing is the enormous amount of rock that had to be removed. Every road, reservoir, storage platform, stairway, and defensive feature required excavation directly into limestone bedrock. While no precise calculation exists for the total volume extracted, the cumulative quantity is substantial. The labour investment would have been immense, especially considering the technological limitations of the period. The Iberians possessed iron tools, but they lacked steel machinery, explosives, hydraulic drills, or mechanized excavation equipment. Yet they succeeded in reshaping large portions of an entire mountain. Similar questions arise at sites such as the rock-cut churches of Lalibela in Ethiopia and the cave complexes of Ellora in India. In each case, archaeologists can identify the finished product but struggle to reconstruct the exact methods used to achieve it. The organization required for such a project may be even more impressive than the physical construction itself. Excavation on this scale implies coordinated labor, resource management, long-term planning, and centralized authority. Workers would have needed food supplies, tool production, maintenance systems, and logistical support. The settlement, therefore, appears not merely as an engineering achievement, but as evidence of a highly organized society capable of managing complex projects over extended periods. Another unresolved mystery concerns the purpose of many carved features scattered throughout the site. Numerous depressions, platforms, and enclosed spaces remain difficult to interpret. Some researchers propose they functioned as storage facilities for agricultural products. Others suggest they served commercial activities, military logistics, or specialized industrial processes. Certain arrangements appear almost modern in their efficiency, leading some archaeologists to describe parts of Castelar de Meca as resembling an ancient transport hub. The site's defensive characteristics add further complexity. Positioned high above surrounding valleys, Castelar de Meca commanded extensive views of regional trade routes. Defensive walls, controlled access points, and naturally protected approaches indicate that security played an important role in the settlement's design. Yet the infrastructure inside the site often appears optimized for economic activity rather than purely military purposes. This dual character has fueled ongoing debate. Was Castella de Mecca primarily a fortress, a trading center, an administrative hub, or a combination of all three? The volcanic plateau of Rujum el Hiri hides one of the oldest and strangest megalithic structures on Earth. Thousands of black basalt stones form enormous concentric rings older than many pyramids, larger than some Bronze Age settlements, and almost invisible from ground level. The site has puzzled archaeologists for decades. No one fully agrees on who built it, how they measured it, or why its massive stone circles appear aligned with the sky itself. Unlike famous ancient monuments that dominated historical records, Rujum el Hiri remained largely unknown for centuries because its true shape cannot easily be recognized from the ground. The structure blends into the dark basalt landscape of the Golan Heights, around 16 kilometers east of the Sea of Galilee. The site was properly identified only after aerial surveys conducted during the 20th century revealed its enormous circular geometry. From above, archaeologists suddenly saw a giant system of concentric stone rings surrounding a central cairn. The entire complex spans roughly 150 meters in diameter and contains an estimated 40,000 tons of basalt rock. Radiocarbon evidence and pottery fragments suggest the outer rings may date to around 2700 BCE, placing the structure in the early Bronze Age, possibly older than the final construction phases of Stonehenge and close in age to the earliest Egyptian pyramids. But unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, no major urban civilization existed nearby that could easily explain the planning and labor required for such a massive construction. The greatest mystery surrounding Rujum el Hiri is not simply its size, it is its apparent astronomical precision. Several archaeoastronomers discovered that openings within the stone rings align closely with the sunrise during the summer solstice, while other corridors appear linked to equinox positions and seasonal solar movements. This suggests the builders were tracking the sun with surprising accuracy thousands of years before advanced scientific instruments officially existed in the region. One narrow entrance in particular appears oriented toward the solstice sunrise, as it would have appeared around 3000 BCE. Because Earth's axial tilt slowly changes over millennia through a process called axial precession, these alignments no longer match perfectly today. Ironically, that imperfection became evidence that the structure truly is ancient. To determine solstice points accurately, ancient observers would have needed long-term horizon observations, seasonal tracking over many years, stable geometric reference points, knowledge of angular consistency, and methods for transferring celestial observations into architectural layouts. Even a 1-degree error across a structure nearly 150 meters wide would significantly distort the geometry, yet many sections remain surprisingly coherent despite thousands of years of erosion. Researchers have compared the site to other ancient observatories such as Nabta Playa and the solar alignments of Chaco Culture National Historical Park. But Rujum el Hiri differs in one critical way. It was constructed using dark volcanic basalt in a remote region with no known centralized state power. Some scientists believe the surrounding hills of the Golan Plateau were intentionally incorporated into the astronomical design, effectively turning the natural horizon into part of a giant observational instrument. If true, the builders were thinking not merely as laborers, but as landscape engineers capable of integrating terrain, sunlight, seasonal motion, and architecture into a single functioning system. For a society from the early Bronze Age, that level of environmental calculation remains extremely difficult to explain. Basalt is one of the hardest volcanic stones commonly found in the ancient world, significantly heavier and more difficult to shape than limestone. Yet the people of Rujamel-Hiri moved and arranged approximately 40,000 tons of it into massive concentric circles without evidence of advanced metal tools, wheeled transport systems, or large domesticated draft animals. That creates a major engineering paradox. Archaeologists estimate some stones weigh several hundred kilograms each. Even if smaller groups carry them manually, the logistics would still have required coordinated labor on a scale difficult to explain for scattered pastoral communities of the early Bronze Age. The geometry itself deepens the mystery. Maintaining nearly circular rings across large distances requires some method of centralized measurement. Modern researchers suspect the builders may have used central anchor poles, rope-based radius measurement systems, primitive surveying techniques, and celestial reference markers. The structure contains multiple concentric walls, some over 3 meters thick, arranged in patterns that appear deliberate rather than random. This level of planning resembles later monumental architecture from civilizations far more socially organized. Engineers comparing ancient sites have noted that even slight angular inconsistencies would distort the circles dramatically over such distances, yet many sections maintain consistent curvature despite millennia of collapse and environmental damage. The unavoidable question is how a prehistoric society with limited technology achieved this scale of precision. At the center of Rujamel-Hiri lies a massive stone cairn often interpreted as a burial chamber, but excavations revealed something deeply strange. Evidence suggests the cairn may have been added centuries after the outer rings were already constructed. This discovery completely changed how archaeologists interpret the monument. If the burial structure came later, then the original purpose of the site may have had nothing to do with funerary rituals at all. Some researchers now believe the outer rings originally functioned as a ceremonial gathering complex, a seasonal calendar system, an astronomical observatory, a ritual landscape connected to celestial events, or even a territorial marker visible from elevated terrain. The interior pathways are awkward and maze-like, making them impractical for ordinary habitation or military defense. Instead, the layout feels symbolic and highly controlled, almost theatrical in its movement. The site may have been designed for ritual processions or ceremonies linked directly to seasonal observations of the sky. That possibility raises another unsettling idea. The people who built Rujamel-Hiri may have organized entire social rituals around celestial cycles and the movement of the sun itself. Rujamel-Hiri sits within a volcanic basalt field formed by ancient eruptions across the Golan Heights. Some geological surveys have reported localized magnetic irregularities in the surrounding terrain, though the evidence remains debated. Still, the connection between megalithic structures and unusual geology appears repeatedly across the ancient world. Sites such as Stonehenge and Karnak stones are also associated with distinctive geological environments. Ancient cultures often treated volcanically active zones, fault lines, springs, and unusual rock formations as sacred places. Modern archaeologists increasingly suspect prehistoric builders selected locations not randomly, but because they perceived subtle environmental properties tied to spirituality or cosmology. At Rujamel-Hiri, the black basalt landscape creates an almost unnatural visual effect. Under certain lighting conditions, the rings appear to dissolve into the terrain itself. This may explain why the monument remained hidden for so long, and perhaps why it was intentionally constructed there in the first place. One of the strangest aspects of Rujamel-Hiri is that its full geometry only becomes obvious from above. At ground level, visitors mostly see scattered walls of volcanic stone, but aerial imagery reveals a giant circular design stretching across the plateau with remarkable symmetry. This has fueled endless speculation. Of course, there is no scientific evidence that ancient people possessed aerial technology, yet archaeologists still struggle to explain why such enormous geometric effort was invested into a pattern difficult to appreciate from human eye level. Some researchers argue the design may have been intended for symbolic rather than visual purposes, perhaps representing cosmological beliefs, sacred circles, or celestial cycles. Others suggest elevated observation points on nearby hills may once have revealed more of the design than is visible today. Whatever the explanation, Rugum el-Hiri belongs to a category of ancient structures whose true form only emerges when viewed at scale. That alone makes it one of the most psychologically unsettling monuments of the prehistoric world. Do you think Rugum el-Hiri was truly an ancient observatory, or evidence of a lost knowledge we still don't fully understand? Share your theory in the comments below. In the desert plains south of ancient Babylon stands a shattered tower that many early travelers believed was the real Tower of Babel. Its summit is blackened as if burned by impossible heat. Its core was built from mud brick, one of the weakest building materials in the ancient world, yet the structure has survived for more than 2,000 years. This is Borsippa, one of the most mysterious ruins of Mesopotamia, and perhaps one of the clearest examples of ancient engineering that still refuses to fully explain itself. Not far from Babylon, Borsippa was once a major religious and intellectual center of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. The city was dedicated to Nabu, the Mesopotamian god of wisdom, writing, and knowledge. Ancient texts describe the city as a sacred place tied to learning and celestial observation. At its center stood an enormous ziggurat, known today as Birs Nimrud, a stepped tower that dominated the surrounding plains for kilometers. European explorers arriving in the 18th and 19th centuries were stunned by its appearance. Unlike many ruined Mesopotamian structures that had collapsed into low mounds, Borsippa still rose dramatically from the desert, its upper sections twisted, fractured, and darkened by fire. Some immediately connected it to the biblical story of Babel. Others believed lightning had struck the tower repeatedly across centuries. Even today, standing before the ruins creates the impression that the structure suffered a catastrophe violent enough to scar the stone itself. The greatest mystery surrounding Borsippa is not simply its size, but the fact that it still exists at all. The ziggurat was constructed primarily from sun-dried mud brick, a material highly vulnerable to water, erosion, heat stress, and structural collapse. Modern mud brick buildings in harsh climates often deteriorate within decades without constant maintenance. Yet Borsippa survived more than 2 millennia of sandstorms, seasonal flooding, extreme temperature shifts, and abandonment. Archaeologists studying the structure discovered that the Babylonians used sophisticated, layered engineering techniques inside the tower. Massive cores of mud brick were protected by outer layers of keyline-fired bricks bonded with bitumen, a natural asphalt-like substance resistant to moisture. This combination created a form of environmental shielding far more advanced than many historians once assumed possible for the period. But even this does not fully explain the tower's endurance. The internal weight distribution of the ziggurat appears unusually effective at preventing catastrophic collapse. The lower terraces absorbed pressure through step geometry that dispersed vertical force outward rather than directly downward. In several areas, drainage systems appear to have redirected water away from vulnerable sections of the core. Some engineers comparing Mesopotamian ziggurats to later ancient structures have pointed out that many civilizations using stone suffered total structural failure over time. While Borsippa's mud brick skeleton still remains visible today, that contradiction is part of what makes the site so unsettling. By conventional expectations, it should not have survived longer than massive stone monuments elsewhere in the ancient world. The darkened summit of the tower became another source of speculation. Travelers in the 19th century described the upper bricks as appearing partially vitrified, as though exposed to extremely intense heat. Some surfaces looked melted or fused together. Local legends claim the tower had been destroyed by divine fire from the heavens. Early biblical scholars used the blackened summit as evidence supporting the Tower of Babel connection. Modern archaeology proposes more grounded explanations: repeated lightning strikes, warfare, ritual fires, or long-term thermal damage from desert exposure. Yet none fully account for the dramatic visual appearance of the upper structure. Even today, drone footage of the ruins gives the impression of a tower scorched by an event powerful enough to permanently alter the material itself. The association with Babel became even stronger because Borsippa matched several symbolic elements from later traditions. Ancient writings described a tower reaching toward the heavens, interrupted before completion. Nebuchadnezzar II himself left inscriptions stating that he restored the ziggurat after it had fallen into ruin. One inscription speaks of an ancient structure abandoned long before his reign, its upper sections unfinished and collapsing. That detail fascinated historians because it suggested the tower may already have carried legendary status even in antiquity. Some researchers believe stories surrounding multiple Mesopotamian ziggurats eventually merged into the biblical Babel narrative. Others argue Borsippa's dramatic appearance made it the most likely inspiration for later imagination. The archaeological history of Borsippa began attracting serious international attention during the 19th century. In the 1850s, British archaeologist Henry Rawlinson investigated the site while studying cuneiform inscriptions across Mesopotamia. Rawlinson's work helped establish that Borsippa was not merely a military ruin, but a major religious center tied directly to Babylonian intellectual life. Excavations uncovered inscriptions dedicated to Nabu, along with brick stamps bearing the name of Nebuchadnezzar II. These stamped bricks became some of the strongest evidence connecting the structure to the Neo-Babylonian Empire at its height during the 6th century BCE. The brick inscriptions revealed something else equally fascinating: standardization on an enormous scale. Millions of bricks across Mesopotamia carried nearly identical royal markings, dimensions, and manufacturing techniques. This suggested the Babylonians operated an organized state-controlled construction system capable of producing and transporting vast quantities of material across difficult terrain. Some historians compare the logistical complexity to Roman imperial infrastructure centuries later. The scale becomes even more impressive considering the environmental limitations of Mesopotamia. Large forests for timber were scarce. Stone resources were limited. Massive construction projects depended heavily on clay extraction, kiln firing, river transport, and coordinated labor systems. Borsippa was not simply a temple, it was evidence of industrial-level organization long before the industrial age existed. Excavations during the 20th century uncovered additional layers of mystery beneath the visible ruins. Archaeologists found evidence that Borsippa was deeply tied to astronomy and scholarly activity. Babylonian civilization possessed some of the most advanced astronomical knowledge of the ancient world. Priests recorded planetary movements, tracked lunar eclipses, and calculated celestial cycles with astonishing precision. Clay tablets linked to Babylonian scholarly traditions suggest temples dedicated to Nabu may have served not only religious functions, but also intellectual and observational ones. Some researchers believe the elevated terraces of the ziggurat may have functioned partly as platforms for observing the night sky above the flat Mesopotamian horizon. This possibility transformed Borsippa from a simple religious monument into something far more intriguing, a hybrid structure combining ritual, mathematics, administration, and astronomical science. The idea is reinforced by Mesopotamia's broader obsession with celestial order. Babylonian astronomers developed predictive methods capable of forecasting eclipses centuries before modern telescopes existed. Their mathematical systems influenced later Greek astronomy and eventually parts of Islamic and European scientific tradition. If Borsippa truly participated in that intellectual network, then the tower represented more than architecture. It represented a civilization attempting to decode the structure of the cosmos itself. The surrounding city also revealed evidence of advanced urban organization. Archaeologists uncovered temple complexes, canals, administrative areas, and defensive structures connected to wider Babylonian infrastructure. Water management appears to have been especially important. Maintaining a large urban center in southern Mesopotamia required constant control over irrigation, flooding, and agricultural distribution. Some canal systems linked to Borsippa may have supported both trade and long-distance transportation of construction materials. This raises another enduring mystery. How did ancient engineers maintain such massive hydraulic systems across unstable desert environments for centuries? Similar questions surround other Mesopotamian cities like Nippur, and Babylon itself, many of which eventually declined after river systems shifted or irrigation networks collapsed. Borsippa's disappearance remains another unresolved puzzle. Ancient records gradually become silent about the city after the classical period. Trade routes changed. Political power shifted. The once great intellectual center slowly dissolved into ruin. Some historians blame environmental degradation caused by salinization and over-irrigation, which damaged agricultural productivity across Mesopotamia. Others point toward warfare, economic collapse, or the changing courses of rivers that sustained urban life. Whatever the cause, Borsippa became another example of how even highly advanced ancient systems could vanish almost completely from history. Perched beside a limestone cliff in Western Ireland, surrounded by one of the harshest landscapes in Europe, the ancient stone fort of Cahercamon still stands after more than 1,000 years. Built in the rocky wilderness of the Burren sometime between the 8th and 9th centuries CE, the fortress appears almost impossible. Massive stone walls weighing thousands of tons were constructed directly beside a steep drop of over 30 meters, in a region fractured by unstable karst limestone. Even modern engineers would approach such terrain cautiously. Yet the builders of Cahercamon created a structure so durable that large sections remained standing despite centuries of Atlantic storms, erosion, and temperature shifts. For decades, archaeologists classified Cahercamon as a simple Irish ring fort. But as excavations continued, the site began revealing details far more complex than expected. Beneath the surface of the stone walls was evidence of advanced engineering, unusual astronomical alignments, and signs of a social hierarchy far wealthier and more sophisticated than historians once believed possible for early medieval Ireland. The fortress was first systematically studied in the 1930s by Harvard archaeologists who carried out major excavations across the site. Their discoveries immediately raised new questions. Instead of a crude defensive enclosure, they uncovered a carefully planned multi-wall fortification system. Cahercamon was constructed with 3 concentric stone ramparts stretching across the only accessible side of the cliff, while the sheer rock face itself formed a natural defensive barrier behind it. This reduced the need for additional walls and demonstrated a highly strategic understanding of terrain optimization. Each excavation season uncovered something new. Archaeologists found ironworking evidence, animal remains, imported objects, and traces of high-status occupation. The discoveries suggested that Kehir was not an isolated farming settlement but a center of regional importance. Some researchers even proposed that it may have functioned as a political or ceremonial stronghold rather than merely a defensive refuge. One of the greatest mysteries surrounding Kehir is the engineering of its dry stone walls. The structure was built entirely without mortar. Thousands of limestone blocks were stacked with extraordinary precision, relying only on balance, weight distribution, and friction to remain stable. In several sections, the walls reached nearly 5 meters thick. Some individual stones weigh several hundred kilograms. This construction method resembles other ancient dry stone engineering traditions found across the world. The polygonal walls of Sacsayhuaman in Peru and the Bronze Age fortifications of Mycenae use similar principles of interlocking stone geometry to resist earthquakes and long-term structural stress. Yet Kehir was built in an isolated Irish limestone region with no evidence of advanced machinery, cranes, or mortar technology. How its builders achieved such structural precision using only basic tools remains unresolved. The geological setting makes the feat even more extraordinary. The Burren is a karst landscape formed from fractured, carboniferous limestone over 320 million years old. The ground is uneven, cracked, and highly unstable in places. Modern geological surveys show that karst terrain is particularly vulnerable to subsidence and water erosion. Constructing a heavy stone fortress near a cliff edge in such conditions would require a deep practical understanding of load distribution and foundation stability. Some sections of Kehir's walls also lean slightly inward, a technique known as battered wall construction. This subtle inward angle helps structures resist collapse by redirecting gravitational forces toward the base. The same principle appeared in several ancient civilizations, including Hittite fortifications in Anatolia and Inca stone architecture in the Andes. The presence of such design logic in early medieval Ireland raises difficult questions about the practical engineering knowledge possessed by its builders. Another major mystery involves the alignment of the fort itself. Researchers studying the site noticed that the main entrance and internal layout do not appear random. Certain openings align with distant limestone ridges and points along the horizon where the sun rises during key seasonal transitions. Although the evidence remains debated, some archaeologists believe Kehir may have incorporated astronomical observations into its design. Ireland already possesses some of the most sophisticated prehistoric astronomical monuments ever discovered. The Passage Tomb of Newgrange, built around 3200 BCE, famously aligns with the winter solstice sunrise, so precisely that sunlight illuminates its inner chamber for only a few minutes each year. Similar alignments exist at sites such as Lough Crew Cairns and Carrowkeel. Because of this tradition, some scholars suspect that fragments of ancient astronomical knowledge survived in Ireland far longer than previously assumed. The question is whether Kehir was simply a military fort or something more complex. From inside the structure, visibility across the Burren landscape is remarkably controlled. Certain vantage points frame specific ridges and pathways while obscuring others. This may have had defensive value, but it also suggests deliberate spatial planning. Some theories propose that the fort served ritual purposes tied to seasonal cycles, elite gatherings, or territorial symbolism. The scale of the site creates another puzzle. Kehir encloses an area of more than 1 hectare, large enough to shelter families, livestock, and storage facilities. Yet the surrounding Burren landscape is notoriously difficult for agriculture. Thin soils, exposed rock, and harsh Atlantic weather make large-scale farming challenging even today. Why would a community invest enormous labor into constructing a massive stone complex in such an unforgiving environment? One possible explanation lies in trade and regional control. The Burren occupies a strategic position near routes connecting inland Ireland to Atlantic coastal zones. Archaeological evidence suggests long-distance exchange networks existed in Western Ireland during the early medieval period. Imported objects found at Carracomán indicate access to resources beyond the immediate region. This has led some historians to argue that the fort belonged to a powerful elite, controlling movement, trade, and political influence across the area. Excavations also revealed evidence of specialized activities uncommon for ordinary settlements. Iron slag and metalworking traces indicate on-site production or repair of tools and weapons. Animal bone analysis suggests selective consumption patterns associated with higher status communities. Some remains belong to younger cattle, which were economically valuable and usually reserved for feasting or elite use. These findings support the idea that Carracomán was occupied by a wealthy and influential social class. Yet despite all these discoveries, enormous gaps remain in understanding the site. No written records describe its construction. No surviving Irish manuscripts explain the engineering techniques used. Archaeologists still debate how long the fort was occupied, whether it functioned continuously or if it served ceremonial purposes during certain periods of the year. Even the durability of the structure itself remains astonishing. Dry stone architecture is highly vulnerable to moisture penetration and freeze-thaw cycles. Western Ireland experiences constant humidity, salt-laden winds, and heavy rainfall exceeding 1,000 millimeters annually in some areas. Under such conditions, poorly balanced walls should gradually collapse. Yet many sections of Carracomán survived for over a millennium. Modern structural engineers studying dry stone systems note that the fortress displays unusually efficient weight distribution and stone placement compared to many contemporary European structures. There are also signs that the visible ruins may represent only part of a much larger complex. Erosion around the cliff edge may have destroyed terraces, outer pathways, or secondary structures over centuries. Some researchers believe additional features once extended farther along the limestone plateau before natural collapse erased them from the landscape. Do you think Carracomán was simply a fortress? Or could it have been part of a much larger ceremonial and astronomical system lost to history? Share your thoughts in the comments below. In the scorching plains of southwestern Iran, a massive pyramid of baked mud bricks has survived for more than 3,000 years in conditions that should have destroyed it centuries ago. Chogha Zanbil was not built from granite like the pyramids of Egypt, nor carved into mountains like Petra. It was built mostly from fragile earth exposed to brutal heat, seasonal flooding, salt erosion, and time itself. Yet the core of the structure still stands. Even more unsettling is the civilization behind it. The Elamites once rivaled Babylon and Assyria, controlled major trade networks across the ancient Near East, and engineered one of the most sophisticated sacred cities of the Bronze Age. Today, most people have never even heard their name. Chogha Zanbil rises from the Khuzestan plain near the ancient city of Susa in modern-day Iran. The site was founded around 1250 BCE by the Elamite king Untashnaparisha, who attempted to create an enormous religious capital dedicated to the gods Inshushinak and Naparisha. Unlike many ancient cities that evolved gradually over centuries, Chogha Zanbil appears to have been planned almost entirely from the beginning. Concentric defensive walls surrounded temples, royal compounds, storage areas, and at the center stood a colossal ziggurat, originally reaching nearly 50 meters high. For thousands of years, the city disappeared beneath desert soil until accidental discoveries connected to oil exploration in the 1930s brought attention to strange inscribed bricks emerging from the ground. French archaeologist Roman Gershman later led large-scale excavations beginning in 1951, uncovering one of the most extraordinary archaeological sites ever found in the ancient Near East. The greatest mystery surrounding Chogha-Zanbil is not simply the scale of the ziggurat, it is the impossible survival of its engineering. Most mud brick structures from the Bronze Age collapsed long ago into unrecognizable mounds. Even in Mesopotamia, where mud brick was common, constant restoration was required to keep temples standing. Yet Chogha-Zanbil endured more than 3 millennia, with major portions still recognizable today. Archaeologists discovered that the Elamites combined sun-dried mud bricks with layers of fired bricks placed strategically throughout the structure. Many of these baked bricks were engraved with cuneiform inscriptions, naming Untash Naparisha and invoking divine protection. The precision of the brickwork suggests not random stacking, but a carefully calculated structural system designed to distribute weight across multiple terraces. What makes this even stranger is the environment. Khuzestan experiences extreme summer temperatures that regularly exceed 50 degrees Celsius. The soil contains significant salt concentrations capable of slowly destroying masonry from within. Seasonal water movement can weaken foundations over centuries. Yet the core of the ziggurat resisted complete collapse. Some researchers believe the Elamites may have developed advanced methods of waterproofing and mineral stabilization far earlier than previously assumed. Others point toward the unusually dense firing techniques of the outer bricks, which created surfaces capable of resisting erosion for centuries longer than ordinary mud brick. Similar mysteries appear at ancient Mesopotamian sites such as Ur and Babylon, but Chogha-Zanbil exists under harsher climatic conditions, making its preservation far more difficult to explain. The city's water system deepens the mystery further. Chogha-Zanbil was not built beside a massive river with naturally flowing irrigation. Maintaining a large ceremonial population in such a dry landscape required immense hydraulic planning. Excavations revealed long canals extending from the Des River toward the city, along with reservoirs and filtration systems designed to provide cleaner water. Some archaeologists believe the Elamites created sedimentation basins capable of removing impurities before water entered sacred and residential zones. If accurate, this would mean the civilization understood practical water treatment more than 3,000 years ago. The scale of this hydraulic organization is difficult to overstate. Moving reliable water supplies across kilometers of hostile terrain without modern pumps required precise gradients and long-term maintenance. Similar engineering achievements are often associated with later Persian Qanat systems or Roman aqueducts, yet Chogha-Zanbil predates many of them by centuries. In some sections, archaeologists identified evidence suggesting pressure regulation through carefully angled channels. The implication is startling. A civilization barely remembered by history may have possessed a far more sophisticated understanding of hydrology than once believed. Another unsettling aspect of Chogha-Zanbil is the enormous organizational power required to build it. Tens of millions of bricks may have been used throughout the city complex. Producing such quantities demanded labor forces, fuel supplies, transport systems, food distribution, and centralized administration operating on a massive scale. The inscriptions stamped across countless bricks suggest something close to industrial standardization. Workers repeatedly produced bricks carrying royal inscriptions, almost like a controlled state manufacturing system. Bronze Age societies are often imagined as fragmented kingdoms with limited administrative reach, yet Chogha-Zanbil hints at something far more organized. The logistics alone remain difficult to explain completely. Massive amounts of fuel would have been required to fire bricks in large kilns under desert conditions. Timber resources in the region were limited. meaning fuel either had to be transported or carefully rationed. Archaeologists continue debating how the Elamites sustained construction on this scale for years while simultaneously supporting agriculture, military obligations, and trade. Some compare the project to the centralized labor systems behind Egyptian pyramid construction. But unlike Egypt, the Elamite world remains poorly understood, leaving enormous gaps in the historical record. The city's design also feels strangely modern in its planning. Rather than chaotic expansion, Chogha-Zanbil reveals clear spatial hierarchy. Multiple concentric walls divided sacred zones from administrative and residential sectors. Access became increasingly restricted toward the center, where the ziggurat dominated the landscape. This arrangement suggests controlled ceremonial movement and perhaps political theater designed to reinforce divine authority. Ancient visitors approaching the city would have moved through layers of architecture that gradually intensified the visual power of the sacred core. Many researchers believe the city functioned less as a normal urban center and more as a ceremonial metropolis. That raises another question. Why build such an enormous sacred city in a relatively isolated location? Constructing and maintaining it required extraordinary resources, yet it never became a massive commercial capital comparable to Babylon. Some theories suggest Untashnaparisha intended the site to unify different Elamite populations through shared religion. Others argue it served as a demonstration of royal power, visible across the region. But there may have been another factor. Certain alignments within the complex hint at astronomical or ritual significance that remains poorly understood. The fall of Chogha-Zanbil only intensified its mystery. Around the 7th century BCE, the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal launched devastating campaigns against Elamite territories. Historical inscriptions describe cities burned, temples destroyed, and sacred sites desecrated. Chogha-Zanbil appears to have suffered during this era before eventually being abandoned. Over centuries, the city disappeared beneath layers of dust and soil until only strange mounds remained visible across the plain. Unlike Rome or Athens, the memory of the city faded almost completely from global consciousness. This disappearance reflects a larger mystery surrounding the Elamites themselves. They existed for more than 2,000 years and interacted constantly with Mesopotamian powers, yet modern understanding of their language, religion, and political systems remains incomplete. The Elamite language does not fit neatly into the major language families surrounding it, and many inscriptions remain difficult to interpret fully. Entire sections of their belief system may be permanently lost. Chogha-Zanbil therefore stands not only as an archaeological site, but as physical evidence of a civilization history almost erased. Excavations throughout the 20th century produced discoveries that transformed understanding of the ancient Near East. Roman Gershman's teams uncovered monumental staircases, temples dedicated to multiple gods, royal palaces, underground tombs, glazed decorative bricks, and thousands of inscriptions. Archaeologists also discovered sophisticated drainage channels beneath parts of the complex, revealing that flood and rain management were considered during construction. The ziggurat itself showed evidence of multiple construction phases, suggesting modifications and reinforcements over time rather than crude expansion. One of the most important discoveries involved the city's inscriptions. Many bricks contain nearly identical cuneiform texts stating that Untashnaparisha built the sacred city for the gods. These inscriptions provided critical evidence for identifying the site and understanding its purpose. More importantly, they demonstrated the remarkable consistency of Elamite administrative systems. The repeated inscriptions imply centralized control over production at a scale rarely associated with Bronze Age Iran. Excavators also uncovered evidence of sacrificial and ritual activity around temple zones, animal bones, offering tables, and ceremonial spaces revealed how deeply religion shaped the city's design. Some scholars believe the ziggurat functioned as a symbolic mountain connecting earth and heaven, similar to Mesopotamian sacred architecture. Yet unlike many Mesopotamian ziggurats that were repeatedly rebuilt over centuries, Choga Zanbil appears tied closely to the singular vision of one king. That gives the entire site an unusual sense of frozen time, as if the city represents one enormous unfinished ambition interrupted by collapse. Modern archaeological surveys continue revealing new details using satellite imaging, soil analysis, and material science. Studies of brick composition have shown surprising durability in certain fired sections, while environmental analysis suggests ancient engineers understood far more about local conditions than previously believed. Researchers are also examining how the city's canal systems interacted with seasonal water cycles, potentially reshaping ideas about early hydraulic engineering in the region.